Nancy was alone at work when she was attacked. Two men who were familiar to her viciously assaulted her while she was at work. There were two of them, and they came with weapons. The fragile, petite 20-year-old girl stood no chance. The men came for money, but that seemed insufficient to them. They ordered the girl to undress, tied her hands behind her back with her own bra, and mocked her for what seemed like an endlessly long hour. Eventually, they decided they couldn't leave a witness. They forced the girl to kneel and pointed the weapon at her. She cried, begged for mercy, if not for herself, then for her little daughter. But the killers were relentless. The sound of the gunshot interrupted her pleas. Gasping heavily, Janet opened her eyes and realized she was having a bad dream again, a nightmare that had happened in reality. On Monday, October 24th, 1988, at 8:30 in the morning, the manager called the Pizza Hut restaurant in Austin, Texas, expecting Nancy DePriest, the assistant manager, to answer. She did not pick up. Knowing she likely had a lot to do that morning, he tried calling again a little later and then once more. Still, no one answered. An hour later, he decided to go to the restaurant himself. Nancy had switched shifts with a colleague that morning, and the manager was probably mentally chastising her for forgetting about this. However, upon arrival, he immediately noticed that the service entrance was open, although the door usually remained locked until the restaurant was open to customers. So, Nancy had indeed come to the restaurant and forgotten to lock up behind herself. In the dining area, the manager didn't notice anything unusual at first. That is, until he took a few steps further inside. Suddenly, he realized that the restaurant floor was flooded with water several centimeters deep. Perplexed, the manager called out for Nancy, but again, there was no answer. As he proceeded, he saw a dough mixing machine in operation. So Nancy had started working. But where was she? And why was the entire restaurant flooded? The manager realized that the water was flowing from the men's restroom. He opened the door and, to his horror, discovered Nancy. It became clear why she hadn't been answering. The naked body of the girl was lying under the sink. Her hands were tied with a bra. Her hair was in blood. Her eyes were open, but she seemed not to see anything, staring into space. The man hurried to call 911. Officers noticed that the girl was still alive and immediately took her to the hospital, where she underwent emergency surgery. She was in very bad condition, and no one expected a miracle. Nevertheless, the doctors were obligated to try. At that moment, the girl's relatives had no idea what was happening and continued with their activities, unaware that Nancy was hanging by a thread. Nancy DePriest was only 20 years old, but despite her young age, she was married and raising a young daughter. She had risen to the position of assistant manager at a fairly young age. The restaurant staff loved working under her leadership because they didn't feel like she was their boss, but rather a friend and mentor. She had a very kind, gentle, and nurturing personality that blended well with her responsibility and hard work ethic. Perhaps these qualities were shaped by her upbringing in Japan, where she lived until her teenage years. Nancy was a very active young woman. She participated in beauty contests, enjoyed fishing, skiing, and spending time with friends. She especially liked competing in softball tournaments held among employees of all 23 Pizza Hut restaurants in the district. It was because of a softball game that she swapped shifts on Monday, October 24th, 1988, and asked a nanny to watch her daughter. In the morning, Nancy and her husband Todd left home with their daughter. They had a unique routine for leaving the house together. Nancy would get into the car with their daughter, while Todd would follow them on his motorcycle. Upon arriving at the restaurant's parking lot, Nancy would get out of the car, and Todd would then drive the car to drop off their daughter with the nanny. Todd would then return the car to the restaurant, switch to his motorcycle, and head to the Air Force Base where he worked as a mechanic. It sounds complicated, but the couple only had one car, and their child could only ride in the car. So on Monday, Nancy arrived at the restaurant around 7 a.m. About 40 minutes later, Todd knocked on the employee door, handed Nancy the keys, kissed her goodbye, and headed to the base, unaware that it would be the last time he saw his wife alive. The police began investigating the crime, which they treated as a murder. First and foremost, they determined the cause of the restaurant flooding. It turned out someone had stuffed a blue apron into the sink drain in the men's restroom and turned on the water. It was unlikely that Nancy decided to wash the apron herself. Therefore, the perpetrator seemingly wanted to dispose of evidence in this manner. Nearby on the floor were khaki pants, light blue underwear, and a blood-stained shirt, items belonging to the victim. The only thing missing was her bra, which the perpetrator used to tie the victim's hands behind her back. The bra was still on her when she was taken to the hospital. Additionally, for some reason, the killer did not remove the shell casing of the .22 caliber weapon. It was submerged in the water near where the girl lay. Since the girl was naked, detectives suspected sexual assault. There were no signs of forced entry at the door, leading police to consider whether Nancy let the attacker inside herself or if he had a key. In the restaurant dining area where patrons could play games while waiting for their pizza, they found a hair. The hair lacked a root, making DNA analysis impossible. Of course, they checked the cash register and safe to ensure it wasn't a robbery, as there had been a series of Pizza Hut robberies in Austin that year, with restaurants targeted 4 times. Approaching the floor safe, detectives indeed found it open and empty, missing $150. However, previous robberies occurred closer to the evening and never resulted in such terrible consequences. Could Nancy have recognized the robber, leading to her murder to eliminate her as a witness? Meanwhile, at the hospital, doctors did everything possible to save the girl's life. Unfortunately, they realized they couldn't succeed. They kept her on life support only to allow her loved ones to say goodbye. Nancy's husband, Todd, was at the military base when he was informed that his wife was in a coma at the hospital. He couldn't believe it, as they had seen her just a few hours ago. How could she be in a coma? Todd dropped everything and rushed to the hospital. Calling Nancy's mother, Janet, through tears, he said, "Mom, something's wrong with Nancy." He explained what had happened: an attempted robbery where Nancy was shot. She was put into an induced coma, hooked up to life support, and without it, she wouldn't survive. It's hard to imagine the mother's state of mind, having to rush to the hospital, knowing she was going to say goodbye to her beloved daughter. As Nancy was an organ donor, her heart, liver, both kidneys, corneas, and bone marrow were harvested. After that, her body was handed over to the medical examiner for an autopsy. The results of Nancy's autopsy confirmed what the police had suspected. She was killed by a single gunshot to the back of her head, but she had also been sexually assaulted prior to that. A sample of semen was sent to the laboratory for DNA analysis. However, it's important to note that this occurred in the year 1988. The accuracy of DNA analysis at that time was far less advanced compared to what law enforcement agencies have access to today. Back then, scientists could only compare one DNA marker line. Therefore, even when a laboratory reported a match, the probability of error was much higher. Now the police were officially investigating Nancy DePriest's murder. Sergeant Hector Polanco was appointed as the lead investigator. Polanco was known for doing everything possible to close cases and obtain confessions. However, in this case, that was not necessarily a compliment. Polanco first spoke with the manager who discovered Nancy. The man had an alibi, which quickly ruled him out as a suspect, but he provided important information about the restaurant's operations and assistant managers like Nancy. They were issued a universal key that could access any Pizza Hut restaurant in Austin. This meant interviewing employees from all network establishments who might have had access to the key. Investigators had to assume that Nancy knew her killer. As a responsible employee, she wouldn't have let a stranger inside. Police also learned that at 8:30 in the morning, Nancy had called suppliers and ordered products for the restaurant. Therefore, the murder occurred between 8:30 and 10 a.m. when the manager found her. The news of the murder spread quickly, and residents were scared knowing a criminal was killing people right at their workplace. Polanco did everything possible to keep details of the case from the public, hoping to catch the perpetrator based on what he knew about the crime. He also asked all employees to report any suspicious behavior of guests or colleagues to the police. Meanwhile, the restaurant had reopened its doors to visitors, but there was now a security guard at the entrance because people feared another robbery. Then, 2 weeks after Nancy DePriest's murder, 2 visitors entered the Pizza Hut restaurant. The young people drove up to the restaurant but didn't immediately go inside. Instead, they stood in the parking lot and shone their headlights on the establishment for about 5 minutes. Then, finally, they entered and ordered a glass of beer. They clinked glasses, and the security guard overheard them drinking to Nancy DePriest. Further into the evening, one of the young men struck up a conversation with the security guard. He introduced himself as Richard and began asking questions about Nancy's murder, where she was found, how she was killed, and if a suspect had been caught yet. When the guard replied that this information wasn't disclosed, the young man speculated that there could have been 2 killers. This made the guard uneasy, and he asked the young man about his interest and where he had been at the time of the murder. The young man explained that he worked at another Pizza Hut restaurant in the network and was actually opening it at the time of the murder. Then, the young men left without finishing their beer. The guard pondered. If Richard was opening another restaurant, it meant he had a universal key. Combining this information with the strange behavior of the visitors, the guard decided to report them to the police. It wasn't difficult for detectives to establish that Richard Denzinger was 18 years old, worked at 2 restaurants in the city, and spent his free time with his manager, Donna Angstadt. His apartment neighbor, Chris Achova, also worked as a cook at another Pizza Hut restaurant. Chris was 22 years old and was the guy who came to the restaurant with Richard. Investigators couldn't ignore questioning the young men. Detectives found Richard at his girlfriend Donna's house and asked him to step outside. According to their report, when they mentioned they were investigating Nancy's murder, he pointed through the door at Donna and said, "There's my alibi." He explained that he was sleeping at Donna's house when Nancy was killed. But previously, he had told the security guard that he was opening another restaurant. An officer asked him to come to the station. They asked him what he knew about the case, and Richard claimed that according to rumors, Nancy was shot in the back of the head with a .22 caliber pistol, and the perpetrator stuffed a blue apron into the sink in the women's restroom to flood the area and wash away evidence. Detectives were puzzled as to how he knew this. Even the new restaurant guard, who was closest to the investigation, didn't know all the details. Richard said he heard it from Donna's boss. When the police called him and asked what color the apron in the sink was, he didn't know the answer to that question. So how did Richard know? Of course, Richard denied being at the crime scene. He insisted he had an alibi, that on October 23rd, he and Chris Achoa bought beer and went to Donna's place. Donna was ironing in the kitchen while they drank beer and played cards. Around 11 o'clock, they invited Donna's friends to join them in a drinking game. Then Chris wanted to go home, but found that his car key was broken. They called another neighbor to pick up Chris. They left at 2 in the morning on October 24th, and Richard stayed overnight at Donna's. They were both very drunk at that point, and overslept for work. At 9:30, the manager called Donna to ask why they hadn't prepared the restaurant for opening. As soon as she hung up, Richard got dressed and ran to the restaurant by 10 a.m., so he had an alibi. Detectives couldn't understand how he knew about the evidence, but they had nothing on Richard, so they let him go. However, at the same time, they questioned his friend Chris Achova. Chris willingly agreed to talk with them. At the station, he was quickly led into an interrogation room where Sergeant Polanco entered. He immediately told Chris that on the streets, they called him El Diablo, which translates to the devil. In the interrogation room, such a statement could sound threatening, but we remember that Sergeant Polanco didn't mince words with suspects, so his approach was more direct. With Chris, Polanco didn't hold back and demanded that Chris tell him everything he knew about Nancy's murder. Chris, of course, said he didn't know anything. Then Polanco started pressuring him. He used various tactics, none of which could be described as ethical interrogation practices. The officer shouted, slammed his fist on the table, and threatened Chris with death if he didn't tell the truth. Considering that this took place in Texas, the threat was palpable. In contrast to Polanco, his partner, Officer Balaja, played the good cop, persuading Chris to tell the truth if he wanted to go home. When even this didn't work, Polanco began to convince Chris that Richard had confessed in the next room and was planning to pin the murder on Chris. Supposedly, the detectives understood that Chris came from a respectable working family and had never had reasons to deal with the police, and he should stop covering for Richard unless he wanted the same fate. Polanco showed him photos from the death scene and promised that he would never be able to hold his loved ones again. He also showed autopsy images of Nancy and demanded that Chris confess to everything and tell what he saw. At some point, a female officer entered the interrogation room who also spoke Spanish, like Chris, and he asked her if he could request a lawyer's assistance. She told him no. This was an outright lie, but Chris didn't know that at the time, and they continued to interrogate him in turns, the good cop and bad cop routine. The interrogation lasted more than 20 hours. Chris wasn't allowed to eat or drink. He was extremely tired, frightened, and exhausted, and his defense began to crumble. Chris confessed to being involved in the murder, but he claimed that Richard was behind it all. When he finally spoke these words, he sincerely believed they would let him go home. However, that wasn't the case. To start with, he had to provide blood, hair, and semen samples at the hospital. After that, the detectives took him to a hotel for the weekend. They told him that he had just implicated Richard and should not return to his apartment. When Monday came, they proceeded to the next stage of the interrogation, during which they uncovered the most gruesome details of the crime. After this, Chris signed his confession in the presence of witnesses. Following the interrogation, Detective Ballas called his brother and said he had just questioned the devil himself. Chris had lifeless eyes, and he had never sat next to such a cold-blooded person before. Chris Ochoa and Richard Denzinger were arrested on the 14th and 15th, respectively. Both were charged with murder, a crime punishable by death in Texas. However, there's a catch. In Texas, mere confessions are insufficient to convict someone of murder. There must be evidence linking the accused to the crime. Therefore, the police and prosecutors relied on the analysis of semen and hair found at the crime scene. Chris's DNA matched that of the rapist, and a pubic hair, believed by experts to possibly belong to Richard, was found. The hair lacked a root, and it was simply compared visually to Richard's hair under a powerful microscope, but it was still only a visual comparison. Before the trial, Chris told his lawyer that he was innocent, but his lawyer didn't believe him. The lawyer explained that the gruesome details in his confession and the partial DNA match indicated his guilt. He could only avoid execution by confessing and testifying against Richard. Therefore, just before the trial began, Chris admitted to firing the fatal shot. In other words, Richard would be tried on charges related to the violence. On May 5th, Chris pleaded guilty to first-degree murder in exchange for a life sentence and testifying against Richard. Richard Denzinger's trial began on January 22, 1990. The young man did not admit guilt, and Nancy's family had to hear all the gruesome details of what they did to her. The prosecutor advised Nancy's mother, Janet, not to attend the trial. However, she felt she needed to know what happened to her daughter. So when Chris took the witness stand, she was in the courtroom and heard everything. It all started at Donna's place that evening. Donna was ironing in the kitchen when Richard told Chris they would rob the restaurant. Chris didn't want to do it, but he couldn't refuse. Richard had a whole plan to ensure they had an alibi. He devised that Chris would pretend to have broken his car keys so their friend would come pick them up, and they would all go home together. Richard would stay with Donna in the meantime, providing them both with an alibi. At 7 in the morning, they met at McDonald's. Richard showed up at the wheel with Donna. He brought the gun. They parked across from the Pizza Hut restaurant and saw Nancy arrive around 7:30 a.m. Using Donna's keys, the young men opened the door. Nancy was preparing dough. She noticed Chris and greeted him kindly. "Oh, hi, Chris," but Richard intervened. He threatened her with the gun, told her to shut up, and show them where the money was. The girl gave them the money from the safe. Then Richard said they needed to kill her, but first they would have some fun. The prosecutor asked if Nancy said anything, and Chris said, "Please stop, no need." She pleaded not to be killed, to spare her life. They silenced her, tied her hands with a bra, and dragged her into the restaurant hall where a pubic hair was found. Throwing the girl on a bench, they abused her. Then Richard ordered her to kneel, handed the gun to Chris, and told him to kill her. Chris held the gun in his left hand, placing his right hand on her shoulder. The girl cried, but Chris shot her, and she fell face down on the tile floor. Chris, horrified, said, "What have I done?" Then they dragged her into the women's restroom, where they again abused her in every possible way. In total, they did this about 10 times, with Chris only doing it to appease Richard. The wound on the girl's head was bleeding, but she didn't move, and they assumed she was already dead. Janet couldn't handle it and ran into the restroom because she felt physically unwell. Then Chris said they cleaned all the surfaces they could have touched. He helped Richard wash Nancy's body and opened the water in the restroom to wash away all the evidence. Chris gave the money to Richard, and they left in 2 cars. On November 9th, when they were relaxing at Donna's again, Richard said he had been to that restaurant on business and suggested Chris go there with him to have a drink. Chris, as usual, didn't want to, but Richard persuaded him again. Donna also testified in court against Richard. She recounted that on the evening of October 23rd, she had drunk a lot and fallen into a deep sleep. But in the morning, when she sat in her car, she noticed that the front seat was pushed back more than usual. In other words, someone had used her car, but the keys were hanging on the hook in their usual place at home. The day passed normally until news of Nancy's death broke. Then Richard immediately said to her, "I was with you, right?" But Donna wasn't sure. She was drunk and could have boasted about sleeping soundly. Initially, she didn't pay attention to these oddities, but later, they seemed suspicious to her. Testimony was also provided by a prison supervisor where Richard and Chris awaited trial. He recounted an incident where Chris helped distribute meals to inmates. As soon as Richard saw Chris, he erupted and shouted, "That's the rat who snitched on me." Richard then poured a drink on Chris and started a fight. According to the prosecution, these words served as additional evidence of Richard's guilt. Naturally, Richard's lawyer tried to argue that the prosecution had nothing but Chris's testimony and a single hair. Richard himself took the stand. He looked directly at Janet and claimed he didn't kill her daughter, that Chris and the police were lying, and that he spent the entire night and morning at Donna's. After 3 hours of deliberation on February 1st, 1990, the jury found Richard guilty of assault against the girl. It took them an additional 7 minutes to recommend a life sentence to the court. Undoubtedly, they believed Chris's gruesome confession and were convinced that the two deserved punishment. Nancy's relatives were satisfied that the justice system had worked effectively. But this is far from the end of this story. On the contrary, 6 years after the conviction of the two men, investigator Manny Fuentes was asked to examine very strange letters written by a prisoner from Texas. His name was Akeem Joseph Marino. The man was serving 3 life sentences for violent acts against women and armed robberies. But this was one of those rare cases where a person had truly changed for the better, had rehabilitated. In prison, he underwent a dependency treatment program and found faith in God. Now his religion demanded that he confess his sins to receive forgiveness for them. Therefore, for several years, the man had been sending letters to the District Attorney of Texas, to the police, and even to the office of George Bush, who was then the governor of Texas. The governor, in particular, received a handwritten letter on 4 pages. To draw attention to the letter, Akeem signed it Confession of Murder. He wrote that in 1988, while in Austin, he assaulted and robbed a 20-year-old girl at a Pizza Hut establishment. The victim's name was Nancy Lena DePriest. He was arrested on another charge literally a couple of days after Nancy's murder, and they confiscated the murder weapon, as well as other evidence capable of proving his guilt, but the police did not pursue these matters. Akeem sent so many letters detailing the crime that he forced the police to investigate them. First of all, he went to the prison to talk to Chris, where Chris categorically refused to speak with him. Texas police investigators were confident that Chris's confession was worth reading, and it became clear who the real killer was. But Manny Fuentes had to be convinced, and something was bothering him. The main issue was that 2 years after the trial of Richard and Chris, Sergeant Polanco was caught on video beating a suspect, attempting to extract a confession. Additionally, he lied on the witness stand, not in Richard and Chris's case, but in other cases. Incredibly, after being suspended, he was able to return to work. However, Fuentes realized that if Polanco lied once, he may have done so repeatedly in the past. Then the detective began to scrutinize the evidence in Nancy's case one by one, and there were numerous inconsistencies. First and foremost, discrepancies in timing stood out. According to Chris, they entered the restaurant practically right after Nancy at 7:30. But we remember that her husband brought Nancy her car keys, and then she placed a grocery order over the phone at 8:30. Furthermore, why did the forensic team find so few clues if the perpetrators were tormenting the victim for over an hour in various locations? Not to mention that the shell casing was discovered nowhere near where, according to Chris's testimony, they shot the girl. Manny Fuentes decided to find out what weapon was seized from Akeem during his arrest. Unexpectedly, it turned out that at the time of the arrest, in addition to the weapon, there was a universal key to Pizza Hut restaurants in his possession, as well as bank packets with the restaurant's name on them and an amount similar to what was stolen from the restaurant. It was entirely unclear why these items were considered his personal property when it was obvious they were related to another crime committed by the man. The police still believed there had to be some connection between Akeem and Richard and Chris. Perhaps there were actually 3 criminals involved, but nothing indicated their connection. Neither letters from prison, visitors, nor cellmates. Finally, Fuentes decided to talk to Akeem. Akeem was calm, confident, and told a very convincing story. On that fateful morning, he was scouting for a restaurant suitable for robbery. He targeted a place where there was only 1 car parked in the lot. He disguised himself as a maintenance worker and pretended to have come to fix something. This was why the restaurant staff let him inside. Initially, he stopped at another restaurant, and an employee allowed him to enter. But Akeem reconsidered robbing it because he hoped to find a woman in the restaurant. He left the establishment and tried his luck at another place, Pizza Hut, where Nancy worked. Of course, the girl let the assumed repairman in. He forced her to hand over the money, then led her to the men's restroom where he forced her to undress at gunpoint and tied her with a bra. He assaulted her in the restaurant hall, where the hair was found. Then he led her back to the men's restroom, promising to handcuff her to a pipe under the sink and leave. However, when the girl bent down to the pipe, Hakim shot her. The girl did not expect this. She did not beg for mercy. The man looked for the shell casing but did not find it and, afraid of losing too much time, fled. Detective Manny Fuentes tried again to talk to Chris, but Chris was afraid that another false confession would be extracted from him and he would be charged with another crime. Additionally, he knew that if he continued to insist on his innocence, he would not see early release because the commission would not believe in his remorse. Therefore, when the detective asked him if he was innocent, Chris replied, "No, I am guilty." Why didn't the investigators come to Richard? Unfortunately, it was already impossible to talk to him. Back in 1991, another inmate attacked the young man. He repeatedly struck him on the head with a boot with a metal toe. The attacker mistook him for someone else, but that no longer mattered. In an attempt to save his life, doctors removed part of Richard's brain. They did not expect him to survive, but he remained alive, if that can be called life, because he never fully recovered. Losing part of his brain meant losing part of himself, unable to care for himself independently. What's worse, he was returned to serve time with other inmates, where he was constantly subjected to abuse, beatings, and other forms of torture. By the year 2000, DNA analysis technologies had significantly advanced. Hakim's samples were compared with the evidence found at the crime scene. The hair and semen belonged to Hakim, as did the weapon. Therefore, there was no evidence linking Richard and Chris to the crime. But how did Chris know so many details about the case? In reality, we don't know what he knew. Detective Polanco tried several times to record Chris's confession on film, but Chris kept saying things that were not what the detective needed. Eventually, they forced him to sign a confession typed by investigators. They knew all the details of the case. The rest they invented. And Chris, worn out, exhausted, ready for anything, signed the confession in the presence of witnesses. In fact, Chris and Richard were just curious young guys who worked in the same restaurant chain as the murdered girl and wanted to know the details of the case, wanted to know if it was safe to continue working in the restaurant chain. But that was enough for a false accusation. Neither of them had problems with the police. Chris grew up respecting law enforcement, but the police intimidated him, didn't allow him to call a lawyer, convinced him they had evidence of Richard's guilt, and Chris gave in under their pressure. Detective Polanco finally retired. In this story, he is a true villain, but he never faced consequences for the harm he caused. It was too late, especially for Richard. The 18-year-old was deprived of freedom, health, and essentially, a normal life. Both men were released in January 2000 after 12 years of imprisonment. Richard received over $10 million in compensation. Chris received $5 million, but gave most of it to Richard. He felt guilty for not being able to protect himself and his friend. To this day, some people believe Chris should spend the rest of his days in prison. But it's easy to say when you haven't experienced days of interrogation without food, water, and under the pressure of El Diablo. Janet visited Hakim in prison to find out why he killed her daughter. He told her that since childhood he had heard voices in his head. And that day he decided that if he met a blonde woman, he would kill her because that appearance was associated in Hakim's mind with a prison guard he despised. He told Janet that her daughter didn't plead for mercy, didn't cry, and didn't know what awaited her. It all ended very quickly. Hearing this, Janet became furious. For years, she believed her daughter begged for her life for over an hour while two men repeatedly abused her. She had nightmares of her daughter suffering. But now she knew for certain that detectives in the police force had invented and exaggerated all the shocking details of this story. Even the jurors were ashamed to have been part of this process. Hakim was sentenced to another life term. He didn't plead guilty due to insanity. He wasn't sentenced to death because Janet opposed it. In fact, the woman became a staunch opponent of the death penalty and, along with Chris Achova, who became a lawyer, advocated for police interrogations to be recorded on film. Janet died in 2019 at the age of 69 from lung cancer. Richard also passed away in 2021 at the age of 50, losing his battle with cancer. But why were Hakim's letters so fiercely ignored? Firstly, because prisoners have a lot of free time in prison, many of them start writing similar letters. Secondly, the Bush office claimed they ignored it only because the man wrote that he had already contacted the district attorney's office. But why didn't the district attorney's office do anything? Of course, no one wants to admit that in such a high-profile case, they unfairly convicted 2 innocent boys and forced them to give testimonies invented by detectives.
November 4, 1989. A quiet night in the fashionable district of Daytona Beach, Florida. Only the lights on the porch illuminate the extravagant mansions whose occupants have long gone to sleep. Suddenly, the silence of the night was shattered by police sirens after a desperate call was received at the rescue service at 4:54 from the Fotopoulos family's house. In the bedroom on the 2nd floor, officers found a man holding his wounded wife to his chest. Another man lay motionless in a pool of blood on the floor. Members of the small but influential Greek community in the city, Costa and Lisa Fotopoulos, along with Lisa's mother and brother, lived in a huge white mansion on the banks of the Halifax River. The officers were met by Lisa's brother, who led them to the bedroom on the 2nd floor. 26-year-old Lisa Fotopoulos was alive but in agony. She had been shot, and the bullet had entered her head, although hope was not yet lost as it had not penetrated her brain. It struck her forehead, deflected off a bone, and came to a rest just above her left eye. While it was still a gunshot wound, and the medics couldn't know the extent of the damage until she was examined at the hospital, they believed she had a chance to survive. They rushed her to the hospital as quickly as possible. As for the young man lying on the floor, there was nothing that could be done for him. Costa had shot the intruder who attacked his wife, emptying the entire magazine into him. While Lisa was being rushed to the hospital and newspapers competed to write about the hero who shot the robber, saving his wife and family, the police began investigating the botched robbery. However, it didn't take long for suspicions to arise among the investigators. On the 1st floor of the house, they found a broken window, indicating the intruder had entered through it. But the window was too small for a sturdy man to fit through without cutting himself. It was also too far from the door handle to open it in such a manner. Furthermore, despite the presence of crystal, silverware, electronics, and artwork in the house, the stranger hadn't touched anything and went straight to the bedroom where he shot Lisa. This raises the question of why her instead of first eliminating the main threat, the husband. Even before morning arrived, the investigators decided to take a closer look at this case and at Lisa's husband. Konstantinos or Costa Fotopoulos grew up in Athens, Greece, in a wonderful family. His father held a prominent position as one of the directors of the Greek airline. Since childhood, Costa dreamed of moving to the United States, where he believed a better life awaited him, a life filled with sports cars, big houses, and beautiful women. At the age of 18, he enrolled in Daytona University, where he studied aviation management. To cover his expenses, he worked as a waiter in a restaurant. It was there that he was introduced to Lisa. Even in the modern world, traditional values still hold importance, and every Greek family in the USA wants to marry their child to someone from Greece, a person with the same faith and cultural heritage. Costa seemed to be the ambitious and intelligent Greek guy that parents wanted to see as Lisa's husband. The young woman was captivated by the charm of this young man. He too was impressed, but not by her beauty or intelligence, but by the state of her family. Within a few months, the couple became engaged, followed by a joyous Greek wedding. Costa and Lisa appeared to be an ideal couple. After a few years, Lisa's father passed away, leaving her and her brother in charge of the family business, a theme park and several souvenir shops. Costa worked for her, her mother, and her brother for $300 a week. It was a decent amount for those times, but not a fortune. Soon, Costa decided to start his own business, something he could fully control. The man took money from his wife and opened a billiard club. For a long time, Lisa had no idea how things were going at the bar and that her husband preferred to hire young kids who, for various reasons, ended up on the streets. Costa surrounded himself with teenagers who were unable to say no to him. He enjoyed portraying himself as a powerful, successful man and would tell the young people that he worked for the CIA, carrying out various government missions. And if any of the kids had doubts about the truthfulness of Costa's words, he had evidence. Framed and hanging on the office wall was a letter from the CIA addressed to Costa. However, if someone bothered to read the letter, they would discover that it was simply a job rejection. Fortunately for Costa, the teenagers believed him unquestioningly, and for them, it was 100% proof that their boss was a secret agent. Things reached a point where Costa invited his business partner, Tony Calderoni, on one of his nocturnal outings. Tony, who didn't believe his friend's tall tales, decided to join him out of curiosity. As a result, he watched with suspicion as Costa, dressed head to toe in camouflage, buried a bag with weapons and money in the woods. The bar trapped Costa in a debt hole. He already owed $20,000, but still continued to enjoy life, playing the role of a super agent. Then, on a beautiful day in 1989, his life became even better after meeting the luxurious 20-year-old Deidre Hunt, who entered his establishment in search of work. Costa was captivated by the beauty of the girl, and soon a romance ensued between them. They didn't care about the 10-year age difference or the fact that Costa was married. Deidre turned out to be the complete opposite of Lisa. Lisa was a true lady, while Deidre was a forbidden fruit, full of passion and desire, something that Costa wasn't getting at home. In turn, he became a source of admiration and expensive gifts for her, providing everything she was lacking in life. Deidre grew up in poverty. She didn't know her father, and her mother suffered from several mental disorders, including multiple personalities, specifically 11 different personalities. The girl never knew what awaited her at home when she returned from school, whether her mother would beat her or shower her with affection. And she had no choice because it was her mother. When Deidre was 7 years old, a neighbor began to harass her, abusing her when she was 11 and he was 31. Instead of support, she only received indifference from her mother. The woman didn't work, spending all the money on alcohol. The situation was worsened by the fact that Deidre had to wear orthopedic braces on her legs to walk properly, and her classmates, sensing Deidre's vulnerability, bullied the ugly duckling. However, everything changed after a few years. She no longer needed the braces, and the girl transformed into a beauty, dark hair, dark eyes, and an attractive figure. She began to receive a lot of attention from men. For Deidre, who had never heard a kind word at her address, it was a kind of drug. She indulged in it fully. At the age of 18, she got involved with a bad crowd and was arrested for armed robbery. After her release, the girl decided to start afresh, and in September 1989, she set off to Daytona Beach, where she could get lost among many street youths. But Deidre didn't get lost. She had charisma and beauty. She quickly became one of the highlights of the bar, strolling around in a black bikini and captivating the regulars. Deidre's difficult childhood and arrest didn't deter Costa. On the contrary, he saw in her a vulnerable girl whom he could manipulate, just like other teenagers hanging out in the bar. Costa rented an apartment for Deidre 2 blocks away from her work, so they could meet at any time. And out of habit, he fed the naive girl stories about his work for the CIA and how he had killed 8 people and so on. Of course, Lisa quickly discovered that her husband was seeing the waitress. She followed him to the rented apartment, confirmed the truth, and demanded that he end the affair. However, he stubbornly denied everything. Then the proud Greek woman threatened to divorce him. Costa couldn't allow that because in the case of a divorce, he would not only be left penniless but also burdened with debts. Interestingly, this conversation took place just a few weeks before an unknown person attempted a nighttime visit to their home. Costa told the police that on the evening of November 4th, he and his wife were watching movies late into the night before going to sleep. The next thing he remembered was waking up to a deafening sound. Opening his eyes, he saw the silhouette of an armed man looming over his wife. Almost instinctively, he grabbed the weapon he kept for self-defense, rolled onto the floor, and emptied the entire magazine at the intruder. Miraculously, The bullet had narrowly missed Lisa's brain, and she not only quickly regained consciousness but also was able to speak. She confirmed her husband's account of them going to bed late and waking up in pain when he was talking on the phone with emergency services. However, Lisa added a few other interesting details. She saw her husband burying a black sports bag in the backyard earlier that evening, for some unknown reason. Furthermore, she recounted an incident that had occurred at her workplace just a week ago when someone had tried to rob her. A young man held a weapon to her and attempted to force her into a small office space. She managed to fall to the floor and crawl between his legs, escaping from him. Fortunately, he didn't pursue her. As detectives listened to her account, they couldn't shake the thought that it might have been an attempt on Lisa Fotopoulos' life, incident number 1. So, who was the unfortunate intruder who broke into their home? It turned out to be an 18-year-old named Brian L. Chase. His father stated that his son had been missing for a while, getting involved with a bad crowd that frequented Costa Fotopoulos bar. As the media buzzed about the incident, the news reached the teenagers who frequented Co-Star's bar. A phone call came into the police, altering the course of the investigation. The call was from a 20-year-old named Newman Taylor. Taylor believed that the police would find it interesting to know that if Brian Chase was the one who died, he had been hired to kill the woman. Taylor was a friend of Deirdre, and a few weeks ago, she offered him $10,000 to kill Lisa. It was a tempting offer, but what stopped him was his knowledge of Costa. Taylor was certain that he wouldn't make it out of the Fotopoulos house alive because Costa had an arsenal of weapons stored there. He refused, realizing that his own death could be part of the plan. Now, when he read the news, he immediately understood what had happened. Brian was his friend, and he didn't want Deirdre and Costa to get away with it. He knew Brian wasn't the killer, but he was terribly afraid of Costa. He realized that both he and Brian were in danger. The investigators believed the witness because it aligned with what they observed at the crime scene. The police wanted to talk to Deirdre, and they got lucky. She showed up at the police station herself. She confirmed Taylor's words but claimed that the idea to kill Lisa belonged not to her but to her lover. Lisa had found out about her husband's affair and planned to divorce him. In the event of a divorce, Costa would be left bankrupt. But if Lisa died, he hoped to receive a $700,000 insurance payout. In addition to that, Deirdre revealed that the bar was actually a front for money laundering. Costa had a business partner in Greece who produced counterfeit banknotes. That's why he hired street teenagers who didn't ask too many questions. The FBI had suspicions about this, but they didn't have evidence yet. Deirdre admitted that besides Taylor, she approached at least 3 other teenagers with an offer to kill Lisa. The initial plan was to attack Lisa at a Halloween party. However, her friend Taja James, who agreed to carry out the task, got scared of the crowd surrounding the victim. The next incident was the one Lisa reported to the police. After Taja's failures, Deirdre persuaded Brian to commit the crime, promising him $5,000. He was supposed to stage a car accident and then shoot her in the head. But Brian's car simply wouldn't start. The next time he tried to break into the house, he was scared off by the neighbors. Only on the 3rd attempt did he manage to get close to Lisa. Costa disabled the alarm, so the young man entered the house unimpeded, walked straight into the bedroom, and shot the sleeping young woman. He was supposed to shoot again, but the gun jammed, and while he was struggling with it, Costa emptied his entire magazine into him. Costa had initially planned to kill Brian to appear as a hero. But when he realized his wife was alive, he and Deirdre started brainstorming how to finish the job. They decided to dress Deirdre as a nurse and deliver a bomb disguised as flowers to Lisa's ward. Fortunately, the police were guarding Lisa's room, and this plan also failed. Deirdre's story seemed so incredible that the investigators could barely believe it. But it didn't end there. In an almost casual tone, sipping on a Diet Cola, and taking a drag from her cigarette, Deirdre claimed that she and Costa had killed before. Their victim was a young man, 19-year-old Mark Kevin Ramsey, who worked at CoStar's bar. The young man knew about the money laundering but, unlike most teenagers who kept their mouths shut, he believed he deserved a share. He threatened to blackmail Costa, and Costa fired him. However, supposedly impressed by the young man's audacity, Costa offered Kevin to join a secret club of hired assassins. According to his words, it was an elite group of trained killers who received thousands of dollars for complex tasks ordered by the CIA. Costa mentioned that all recruits had to undergo an initiation ritual. Kevin agreed and allowed himself to be taken to the woods and bound. Costa promised that he and Deirdre would simply shoot near his feet for a few minutes to make sure he wouldn't flinch and would be capable of such work. Suddenly, Costa gave Deirdre a signal, and she shot Kevin 3 times in the chest. Because it wasn't Kevin's initiation, it was Deirdre's. Then she approached the young man, grabbed him by the hair, lifted his head, and shot him in the temple. After that, Costa took his AK-47 and fired a final shot into Kevin's head. Then they both left without even untying their victim. As a successfully completed initiation ritual, Costa gave Deirdre a black beret and promised to make a monogram for the secret club when she tracked down and killed the next target. Upon hearing this story, the investigators began to suspect that they were dealing with a deranged person. The murder of a teenager, whose disappearance wasn't even reported. Her words seemed too far-fetched to believe. To expose the liar, they asked her to lead them to Kevin's body. Without hesitation, Deirdre showed them the way. The poor boy's body still lay in the woods, where the lovers had left him. But that wasn't all. Deirdre made an even more significant statement that caused a sensation. She claimed the existence of a video capturing Kevin's execution. Initially, Deirdre was enthused about the recording, but then she realized that Costa would use it to keep her as his accomplice under control. Was the girl trying to portray her lover as a psychopath to protect herself? Or was there really a video that would lift the veil of secrecy over the hired assassins club? The investigators had to ascertain this. Costa, of course, denied everything, but upon obtaining a search warrant, the police found a cassette in his garage. It was a fully captured video of the teenager's murder. The boy screamed in pain and terror so intensely that the police officers in the room took a while to recover from what they had witnessed. But the crucial evidence in the recording was that Deirdre followed the instructions of a man behind the camera, a man with a distinct Greek accent. Simultaneously, the police unearthed the sports bag mentioned by Lisa. Inside were an AK-47 and a .22 caliber pistol, which the two had used during Kevin's murder. Deirdre Michelle Hunt and Konstantinos Fotopoulos were charged with the murder of Kevin, Brian, and the attempted murder of Lisa. During Deirdre's trial, prosecutors portrayed her as a ruthless and cold-blooded killer, but during CoStar's trial, they presented her as his victim, someone who believed in his fabrications about secret agents and an exclusive club of top-notch assassins. The prosecutors themselves admitted to perceiving Deirdre's role differently in this case and couldn't agree on the matter. Perhaps the truth, as always, lies somewhere in between. Deirdre's mother testified in her favor, confessing to mistreating her daughter when she was a child. Deirdre saw nothing but chaos in her life, so it's not surprising that she fell under CoStar's influence. According to her testimony, Costa physically and psychologically tortured her, extinguished cigarettes on her, burned her with an iron, and committed other atrocities. An hour before the verdict was announced, she decided to admit her guilt in the crime to avoid the death penalty. However, the judge showed no sympathy towards her. Watching the video of Kevin's murder was enough for him to sentence her to death. Deirdre appealed based on the fact that while she was in prison, awaiting the opportunity to testify against Costa, her lawyer struck a deal with a television show to sell her interview for $5,000. Deceptively, he brought the filming crew to his client, claiming it was merely preparation for her testimony in court, but once there, he revealed they were journalists and persuaded her not to resist and to tell her story. The lawyer was banned from practicing law for a year as punishment. Deirdre's sentence was commuted to life imprisonment. Costa, who was also sentenced to death, filed appeals, but they were unsuccessful. He is still awaiting the execution of his sentence, and possibly enjoying some attention by entertaining viewers with his tales about the CIA. Fortunately, even in this story, there are some positives. The doctors chose not to remove the bullet from Lisa's head, but she fully recovered and continues to lead a normal life, carrying on her father's work in Daytona Beach. She married a wonderful person and left behind the story with Costa and the 6 unsuccessful attempts on her life far behind her.
What a fantastic vacation it was. For 2 weeks, the Lightham family enjoyed the joys of summer relaxation. They went fishing, water skiing, and swam in the cool, clear waters of Greenwood Lake. These 2 weeks in July 2011 were a true idyll, now only living in memories. The last day of that wonderful vacation, the final moments before. As the sun set, the spouses decided to take a boat ride. What they talked about, only they knew. But the consequences of their conversation would harm many, both those they knew and those they did not. This story begins with idle on the lake, but ends with an incredible intertwining of lives of entirely different people, answering the question, how low will a person fall for money, pride, the desire to win despite everything? Who could have thought that it all started with a blind date? Chris, a man of few words and calm demeanor, and Nancy, a cheerful and sociable woman, made a wonderful couple. They got married less than a year after their first date. Thanks to his wife's support, Chris became one of the most influential and successful bankers in the city, achieving dizzying career heights. Nancy worked in a real estate agency and became the treasurer of the State Lottery Commission. After 20 years of marriage, the couple mingled in the highest echelons of Charleston society. 2 wonderful daughters and a mansion in a prestigious neighborhood complemented the image of a happy family. But perfect marriages don't exist. Chris's successful career left him with less and less time for his family, and by their 22nd anniversary in March 2011, he decided to sleep in the guest room so that his snoring wouldn't disturb his wife's rest. Was it a warning sign from his side? Perhaps. But Nancy felt that her husband simply didn't harbor the same feelings towards her as before. This continued for 6 months until that night at the lake. The lake appeared as a black satin canvas against the backdrop of the setting sun. Chris and Nancy sat in the boat, and nobody dared to interrupt the prolonged silence. Then Chris turned to his wife and looked at her with a gaze she had never seen before. Cold, distant, determined. He declared that he wanted a divorce. This statement thundered like a storm out of a clear sky. Nancy couldn't understand how one could so easily give up on 2 decades of marriage, but there was nothing to be done. They decided to divorce amicably, without scandals. Literally a few days later, the spouses celebrated Nancy's 45th birthday together at her favorite Japanese restaurant. Chris and Nancy agreed not to tell the girls about the divorce, and the evening went great, without a single sarcastic remark or unkind glance. When the waiter brought the bill, Chris asked him to take a picture for memory, a picture of the whole family. In the following 18 months, as the divorce process was underway, this picture was forgotten, until its fragment ended up in the most inappropriate hands of a person with murder behind them. Time passed. It was Thursday, April 4th, 2013. Officer Daniel Wilson was driving around Charleston, patrolling the streets, when he noticed something that caught his attention. A man leaned towards the passenger seat of a slowing car. Knowing this part of the city and considering the late hour, the officer realized that there was likely illicit substance trafficking going on. The dealer noticed the policeman and sped away. The driver also attempted to flee, but the officer followed him. The driver turned out to be a middle-aged man named Aaron Wilkinson. In the car with him were his wife and a dog. The man was friendly and admitted to having served time for fraud. But what alarmed the officer was Aaron's lack of a driver's license, and the car was rented under a different name. The absence of a license gave the officer the right to search the car. He found a gun and ammunition. All of this looked bad in the eyes of the law. Clearly understanding this, Aaron unexpectedly blurted out that he had been hired to kill someone, and he had a week to carry out the job. Throughout his service, the officer had heard some absurd stories, but this one he believed because Aaron knew too many details. Investigators took over at the station. Firstly, they asked about the target's family. Lytham, the man replied. The detectives knew this family. Respected members of society, a banker and a member of the State Lottery Commission. Now one of them was in danger. But who exactly? The man was questioned for several hours, repeatedly asked about the murder he claimed he was trying to prevent. It all started 6 days earlier in Kentucky. Aaron's friend, Sammy Janavane, asked him to go on an important errand together. Not right away, but he confessed to his friend that he was planning to kill someone. Aaron was shocked, but he knew Sammy wasn't joking. He already had one murder under his belt. He killed a man who was renting a room in his house, set the body on fire, and went to sleep. Sammy was asleep when his wife smelled smoke. The house burned down, and Sammy, his wife, and 3 children were left homeless. The court agreed that the murder was self-defense, but Sammy was convicted of arson. Sammy and Aaron became friends while serving time in prison. According to Aaron, he had no choice. Sammy had a volatile temper, and it was better to be friends than enemies. Despite his fear, Aaron told Sammy that he didn't want to be involved in the murder and tried to leave, but Sammy promised to give him $2,500 if he just went along. Aaron should have refused and just walked away, but $2,500. He was dependent on illicit substances. The men continued on together. In a small town near Charleston, they bought a prepaid phone to contact the contact person, and when they set off again, Aaron overheard part of the conversation. It was a woman. She booked a hotel room for the meeting, where she gave Sammy the money. $5,000 in cash on top of the $5,000 Sammy already received. And Aaron realized there would be at least another $20,000 after the job, and if it all looked like an unfortunate accident, much more. The job had to be completed within a week, because on Monday the Leathams' divorce process began, and one of the spouses shouldn't appear in court. The woman also gave Sammy an envelope with all the information that might be needed by the killers unfamiliar with the city. Aaron felt a growing sense of unease. Before, everything seemed a little unreal, but now, when he saw the photos, everything changed. He realized that an innocent person had to die, and he was obliged to prevent the crime. But how? Sammy was determined, and if Aaron made a mistake, not only he would suffer, but also his wife. As if on cue, Sammy's phone rang. It was his girlfriend. She accused him of cheating, and the young people had a terrible argument. Aaron saw an opportunity for himself. He persuaded Sammy to go home and make up with his girlfriend. Secretly, Aaron hoped that Sammy would completely abandon the idea of murder, but no. Sammy planned to deal with his girlfriend and immediately return to Charleston. Any other person would have called the police, forgotten about this night incident, but not Aaron. The thought occurred to him to convince Sammy that he would do everything himself. Strangely enough, Sammy agreed. Of course, it was just a trick. He took his wife and dog with him, in case Sammy suspected something, and planned to stay in the hotel until Monday, when the motive for murder disappeared. But they didn't plan to refuse illicit substances, and that's how they got caught. And now they were sitting in the police station, telling the police everything. Investigators didn't know whether to believe the words of a killer who confessed to a murder that hadn't happened yet. On the other hand, what did he have to gain by inventing such a story? Absolutely nothing. Yet the police couldn't act without evidence. But Aaron had it. That envelope with all the information about the victim, left in the hotel room's number. The envelope turned out to be exactly where Aaron said, in his room on the bedside table. There were numerous pictures of the victim, pictures of Nancy Leatham, as well as a mass of personal information about the woman herself, her children, her car, her house. The author of the materials even indicated where the killer should better park the car to avoid suspicion. Nothing revealed the author of the materials, but investigators understood that Aaron hadn't lied. It was necessary to prevent the murder. FBI agents were brought into the case, who organized a phone conversation between Aaron and Sammy to catch the accomplice. Aaron was afraid and didn't want to do it, but he was persuaded. The conversation turned out to be impressive. Sammy not only talked about the weapon, but also gave approval for Aaron to deal with any accompanying victim who might stand in the way of Nancy Leatham, including the woman's younger daughter, who lived with her in the same house. This was enough to put Sammy under constant surveillance. They knew that the woman gave him the envelope, and she needed to be found. But before that, another woman needed to be found. Nancy Leatham had to know that someone wanted to kill her, and as soon as possible. What was Nancy doing during this time? 18 months have passed since that evening at the lake, when her husband expressed his desire for a divorce. During this time, she and her younger daughter rented a house several blocks away from the family mansion, which sat empty, awaiting a new family to move in. For a year and a half, she and her husband argued over money, property, and the blame for the divorce. But soon it will all be over. The divorce process was supposed to begin on Monday. Nancy's mind was preoccupied with the impending showdown in the courthouse, when there was a knock on her door. It turned out to be 2 federal agents. They stated that someone had hired a hitman to kill her and showed her the envelope found on the would-be assassin, Aaron Wilkinson. Horrified, Nancy looked at the details of her own life, where she parked her car, where she shopped, which route she preferred to drive, and so on. She sifted through the photographs until she came across a picture from the Japanese restaurant, the family's last photo. It was torn in half, and only her younger daughter and herself were left in the photo. Now Nancy had no doubt that all of this was the work of her husband. It even seemed to her that she recognized his handwriting. What she didn't understand was that he had put their younger daughter in danger. After all, her husband knew that, unlike her older sister, she lived with her mother. Was he really willing for his daughter to become a victim of the hitman he had hired? The agents had no doubt that Chris Leatham was involved in the conspiracy. What they didn't know was how the banker from Charleston had met the former convict from Kentucky, and who was the woman who handed him the envelope. Nancy couldn't understand why her marriage was falling apart. But her friends were convinced that there was something more behind Chris's desire for divorce than just cooled-off feelings. They persuaded Nancy to find out everything. The woman didn't know how to do it until one evening when her husband rushed off to an urgent meeting and left his wallet on the table. The hesitation was brief. Inside, the woman found a label from potency pills. It was news to her that he was taking them. But it didn't end there. Her husband had a whole arsenal of such remedies, such as testosterone gel. If Nancy had suspected nothing before, she couldn't be stopped now. She knew her husband had a habit of recording all passwords. Finding the password for his phone, she learned that when her husband moved to sleep in the guest room, he spent whole days texting with some woman and only stopped during working hours. Nancy was sure his lover was working with him. Furthermore, the woman found out that her husband had registered on a dating site and was actively using it. This was enough to turn to a private detective, one of the three who had been working for her for several months. He confirmed that Chris was having an affair with a co-worker. If at first the spouses decided to part amicably, now there could be no talk of that. Nancy demanded that Chris leave the house. In turn, the man arranged for her dismissal and closed her credit cards. He handed Nancy a check and said that the next one she would receive would be only in January. It was mid-November. Nancy needed to pay for the house, gas, food, gifts for the children, and he left her with only $300. At that moment, the Leathams' divorce turned from loving to disgusting. It is important to delve deeper into the law of South Carolina. It punishes adultery, but not just any. The family's breadwinner, usually the man, doesn't have to pay alimony to his ex-wife if he can prove that she cheated on him. And it doesn't matter whether he cheated once, more than once, or more frequently. In the eyes of the law, only the wife's infidelity matters. That was the case in 2013, and that's the way things are even today. In other words, even if Chris Leatham admitted his infidelity, he lost nothing. However, Nancy knew how jealously he guarded his image. She knew he would be more likely to agree to her terms than to let his reputation be destroyed. Therefore, she continued to dig further. 6 months before the idea of a contract killing surfaced, Nancy learned that her husband's mistress, whom she had been tracking all this time, had been replaced. Chris Leatham was seeing another woman. Her name was Wendy Moore. At 39, she looked like a cover girl, a tall blonde with a snow-white smile and big blue eyes. She worked as Chris's assistant. Nancy first saw Wendy in the summer of 2012, when she gave testimony before the start of the divorce proceedings. The young woman claimed to have recently divorced, blaming Nancy for the divorce. Supposedly, her private investigator sniffed around and told her husband that she was having an affair with Chris Leatham. Nancy was shocked. In fact, she didn't even know Wendy's husband's name, but now she decided to meet him. The man's name was Matt, and he immediately admitted that he had lied about the conversation with the private detective. For months, his wife had been coming home and complaining about how tired she was of covering up the affair between her boss and another co-worker. And suddenly everything changed. She stopped complaining, started carefully choosing her clothes and hairstyle, and stayed late after work. Matt suspected a romance between Chris and Wendy, and hoped the story about the detective would force his wife to confess. Matt decided to tell Nancy something else. 10 years ago, when Wendy still lived in Kentucky, she ran a private strip club at home, where according to Matt, clients could expect more than just a striptease. He and his wife and 3 children lived on the second floor of the house, while Wendy and a few other girls worked downstairs. Matt added that they supposedly even filmed unsuspecting clients. Wendy's husband Sam hired a security guard to handle noisy clients. This went on until one night when Sam argued with the guard, killed him, set fire to the body, and went to sleep, leaving the kitchen on fire. He was sleeping when Wendy smelled smoke and called the fire department. The court ruled the killing of the guard as self-defense, and a doctor explained the man's behavior as post-traumatic stress disorder, but he was still charged with arson. Sam went to jail, and Wendy divorced him, starting life anew. She raised the children and received a college education at home, which later allowed her to get a job at Chris Leatham's bank. Sensing a golden opportunity, Nancy decided to dig up everything she could about Wendy. She even contemplated going to Kentucky to track down her first husband, Sam Enavena, and only a few months later did she find out that the man she had been eager to meet was hunting her down in Charleston. The detectives didn't take much time to establish that Wendy was the one who delivered the package with photos and money to Sam and Aaron. She was arrested. Chris Leatham hired a lawyer for his mistress, and didn't even bother to call his ex-wife to ask how she was feeling given that a killer was after her. Nancy and her daughters, along with 2 police officers, were living in a small rented apartment at the time. Her elder daughter was prohibited from attending college until the end of the year because she posed a danger to other students. Nancy hoped that following Aaron, Sam, and Wendy's arrests, Chris would also be arrested. But the prosecutor wasn't in a hurry, and their detention continued for several months. While Nancy and her daughters were in hiding, Chris continued to enjoy life, working at the bank and taking care of Wendy's children. A huge blow to the investigation came when, 2 months after Sam's arrest, he was found dead in his cell. He could have revealed a lot, could have named all the accomplices, but now the agents had to look for any other evidence of Chris Letham's involvement. The most significant witness against Chris turned out to be Chris himself. He and Wendy spoke on the phone every day, and the police naturally recorded every conversation. It turned out they had developed a code word for Sam's lawyer, and Chris was the one paying for his services. In other words, he was paying the lawyer of the man who was supposed to kill his wife, the mother of his children. Furthermore, the detectives found out that 2 printers and Wendy's laptop unexpectedly disappeared from Chris's office. However, the bank where they worked was very strict about security. Information on the bank's server showed that someone from Wendy's computer was searching for photos and information related to Nancy, and then sent that same information to the printer. The same photos and maps were later found in the envelope of the hitman. Apple initially didn't cooperate, but eventually provided information from Chris's phone, which also yielded results. One of the key photos found in the envelope was taken with Chris's phone. This allowed them to tie him to the criminal conspiracy. 8 out of 11 pages in that envelope were linked to Chris's phone, computer, or printer. In other words, he was involved in the conspiracy at every stage. 4 months later, a warrant for his arrest was issued, but the agents didn't know where he was. They called Nancy. She speculated that he might be vacationing at Lake Jocassee. But where exactly? She promised to find out where he might be. Nancy asked her younger daughter to log into Facebook and asked to see the profiles of her father's best friend's children. One girl wrote, "We're at Lake Jocassee in a house for 14 people. There are 21 of us. How will we fit here?" The girl also mentioned that Wendy's children and other friends of Chris Letham's children were there. A quick search on a search engine yielded a list of properties at Lake Jocassee available for rent. But only one cottage was designed for 14 people. Nancy called the owner of the house and got the address, which she was able to provide to the police. Her husband was arrested on her birthday. Nancy considered it the best gift she could receive. The trial began. Wendy and Chris were tried together, and they were careful not to incriminate each other in their own words. The most serious evidence was against Wendy. It was she who met with the perpetrators. She delivered the envelope, bought a prepaid phone for conversations with Sam, and finally, it was she who sent him money, signing a false name, a porn star's name. The case against Chris was built more on the fact that he had a romantic relationship with Wendy, but only he could provide personal information that ended up in the envelope. The lawyers tried to argue that he didn't lose anything in the divorce, but he wouldn't have paid alimony to Nancy unless he could prove her infidelity. Otherwise, with a salary of $650,000 a year, he would have been transferring $7,500 to Nancy for the rest of his life. Moreover, the divorce process reflected poorly on his reputation. Nancy disappeared, and so did all his problems. In the end, the jury found Wendy guilty on all counts. She was sentenced to 15 years in prison. Chris was found guilty on only one of the 3 counts because not all the jurors believed that he had been involved in the conspiracy from the beginning. He was sentenced to 10 years in prison. After all that happened, Nancy left South Carolina. In prison, Chris struck a deal, and she received most of the proceeds from the sale of their family property. Now she has a real job where she is highly valued. Nancy only met Aaron Wilkinson at the trial. She remembers how he found her face in the crowd and said with his lips, "Forgive me." This gesture seemed so sincere to Nancy that she had no doubt. She owed her life to him. She promised to speak at the trial to ask the judge to show leniency if he struck a deal, and testified against Chris and Wendy. She kept her word and spoke touchingly in his support. The judge sentenced him to the minimum term of imprisonment, 4 years. The last known information about Aaron is that he doesn't use banned substances and works in a drug rehabilitation center. He is married and raising 2 children. Chris and Wendy's unity fell apart during the appeal. Wendy claimed she was just following orders, obviously hinting that Chris was behind everything. Chris insisted that the hired assassination was fiction and the work of a sociopath. Who was he talking about? Wendy? Sam? Aaron? Be that as it may, Wendy's sentence was reduced because the court decided that 15 years was too harsh a punishment. Wendy was released in October 2021. Chris was released in January 2022. They spent just over 7 years in prison. After their release, they lead quiet lives, but not together. It is not exactly known who came up with the idea to get rid of Nancy Letham. We will probably never find out. But one thing we know for sure, thanks to the suddenly awakened conscience of a drug-addicted criminal, This story is not a mystery of Nancy Leatham's murder.
In the quiet suburb of Harahan, Louisiana, USA, a tragedy unfolded, shattering the familiar world and ill that once prevailed on its peaceful streets. At the center of this story was young Bella Fontanelle, a 6-year-old girl, whose life was unexpectedly cut short in the one place where she should have felt truly safe. Today, she could have finished kindergarten, enjoyed summer days, and swam in the pool, but Bella won't be able to do any of that. Not today, not ever. Because her life was heartlessly taken away from her. Taken away by someone who should have loved her and cared for her. The circumstances surrounding her deaths seemed as terrifying as they were confusing until a video emerged, casting doubt on the closest person to the girl and revealing the truth about what happened on that warm April evening in 2023. Louisiana is a multicultural state, but even among this diverse backdrop, the family of Michael Fontanelle and Jennifer Celadon stood out. Michael was an American of French descent, while Jennifer had Honduran roots. Together, they brought two beautiful girls, Aria and Bella, but unfortunately, they soon decided to part ways. The separation was not easy, but Michael and Jennifer tried their best to ensure it wouldn't negatively impact their children. They agreed on shared custody of their daughters, and since their homes were just 2 blocks apart, Aria and Bella could comfortably live between both houses. After some time had passed since Michael and Jennifer's separation, Michael began dating another woman, with whom they eventually moved in together. Michael's new love interest was 43 years old, and she went by the name Bannock Lim, although she also referred to herself as Bannock Landon or Hannah Landon. While Hannah lived with Michael, she spent a lot of time with the girls. Although Michael and Hannah were not married, throughout the years she lived with him, she acted as a caring stepmother to the girls. She got along well with the children, especially Bella. They went on walks together, rode bicycles, and swam in the pool. That's how the family lived until April 2023. On April 25th, Michael had an extremely long and challenging day at work. He returned home late and was so exhausted that he went straight to the bedroom and fell asleep as soon as his head touched the pillow. He didn't bother going into the girls' rooms, assuming they were already asleep. Hannah was not in the bedroom, but that didn't bother him since she often slept on the couch to avoid disturbing his rest. The next morning, when 7-year-old Aria Fontanelle woke up, she was thrilled that the Tooth Fairy had visited her during the night. The little girl couldn't wait to share her excitement with her younger sister. However, when she and her father entered Bella's room, her bed was empty. Michael thought Bella was playing hide and seek. He and Aria searched the house inside and out, but there was no sign of Bella or Hannah. Michael couldn't fathom where his girlfriend and 6-year-old daughter could have gone, leaving Aria behind. Harahan was known as a very safe place, with a population of less than 9,000 people where everyone knew each other. The idea of a crime happening there didn't even cross his mind. Nevertheless, at 7:30 in the morning, the worried father was already walking into the local police station to report the disappearance of his daughter and girlfriend. The police immediately got to work, starting with a search of the street where Michael and Hannah lived. At 8:20, the officers approached the home of Bella's mother, Jennifer, who lived 2 blocks away from Michael's house. They initially thought it would be a routine check, but as they entered the front yard, they noticed a large 38-liter plastic bucket, typically used for storing chemicals like chlorine for pool disinfection, placed conspicuously. Cautiously, they opened the bucket and recoiled in horror at what they found inside, the lifeless body of Bella Fontanelle. Jennifer was at home that morning, but fortunately, she hadn't stepped outside and made the horrifying discovery. It's difficult to imagine the agony a mother would experience finding her daughter's body in a bucket on the very same yard where Bella loved to play with her sister. The police immediately launched a murder investigation. But where was Hannah, and what had happened to her? Was she the next victim on the list of this deranged killer? Now, the police had to not only investigate Bella's murder, but also the possible abduction of Hannah. The situation was becoming increasingly distressing and complicated. While the officers were investigating these two cases, they received footage from surveillance cameras on Jennifer and Michael's street. Many neighbors provided access to their cameras for the police. One of the recordings was particularly chilling. At 9:33, the video showed a woman in a red blouse, black pants, and white shoes calmly walking towards Jennifer's house. She was pushing a cart with a white plastic bucket on it, identical to the one in which Bella was found. Despite carrying suspicious cargo, she appeared calm and didn't even get flustered or attempt to move away when a car passed by her. In the meantime, the police managed to locate Hannah. She was found in a hospital as a patient, awaiting a medical evaluation regarding her mental health. Interestingly, it was the police themselves who had taken her to the hospital. Hannah appeared disoriented and lost when she showed up at the police station late at night on Wednesday, nearly after midnight. She seemed to be in distress, stating that she had family problems and needed to hug her mother and grandmother. However, she refused to elaborate on the nature of these family issues. The officers interacted with her for about 2 hours before calling for an ambulance. They then transported her to the East Jefferson General Hospital for a psychiatric evaluation. It remains unclear why the police spent so much time trying to locate someone they eventually took to the hospital themselves. Possibly, different police units did not connect the cases, or there might have been confusion due to Hannah using different names. Nevertheless, she was immediately detained and brought back to the police station for questioning because she was the woman seen in the video transporting the plastic bucket to Jennifer's house. Hannah was still wearing the same outfit as in the video, a pink blouse, black pants, and white shoes, which matched the clothing of the woman on the footage. Detectives seized these items as evidence and handed them over to the forensic analysts for further analysis. The matter seemed tangled until the police uncovered a long history between Hannah and Jennifer. The relationship between the women could hardly be called friendly, even with a lot of strain. Things escalated to the point where police intervention was necessary. On August 8, 2021, at the Riverside Country Club, Aria and Bella were competing in a swimming competition. Jennifer and her sister Evelyn came to support the girls. According to the police report, which was called due to the women's argument, when one of the girls finished her part of the program, Jennifer approached to hug her daughter and tell her what a good job she did. A normal thing to do. However, this didn't sit well with Hannah, who caused a commotion by stating that it was a day for the girls to spend with Michael. In her opinion, if it was Michael's week, all family members from the mother's side should ignore Aria and Bella, not even come close to them. As absurd as it may sound, Hannah firmly believed in this. Evelyn complained about Hannah's behavior to Michael, who, of course, agreed that a mother should be allowed to congratulate her child after a successful performance in a competition. Yet, Hannah didn't back down. She took out her phone and started recording. There was no sense or necessity in capturing the ridiculous argument unfolding before the children. Evelyn raised her hand and asked Hannah to stop. She didn't attempt to grab the phone, she probably just wanted to shield herself from the camera. However, this action triggered Hannah. She slapped Evelyn's hand, and in response, Evelyn asked her not to do that again. This made Hannah grab Evelyn's hair. The two women engaged in a physical struggle, pulling each other's hair until bystanders intervened to separate them. The police arrived at the scene and noticed scratches under Evelyn's left eye and on her left hand. Her face was slightly swollen and bleeding. When the officers asked Hannah to explain what happened, she refused to talk to them until they threatened to arrest her. Then she claimed that she just wanted to take one of the girls out of the pool because she was cold. Out of nowhere, Evelyn approached her from behind, turned her face toward her, and attacked her. Hannah allegedly took out her phone to capture the attack on her. But when the officers asked the woman to provide her phone number, she claimed that she doesn't use a mobile phone, just like Michael. She stated that people contact her through email. However, Michael immediately provided his phone number. Hannah complained about back pain but refused to go to a separate area to document her injuries. She didn't behave like someone who had been assaulted and would typically seek to gather all possible evidence. Unlike the consistent accounts of Evelyn and Jennifer, Hannah had no one to support her version of events because Michael was on the other side of the pool. Moreover, it was hard for the police to believe someone who lied about something as simple as having a phone. A little over a month after the swimming competition, Hannah decided that she needed a restraining order to prevent Jennifer and Evelyn from approaching her. In her statement, she described the poolside argument, but her version was radically different from what she initially told the officers. Supposedly, on that day, Jennifer came up to her from behind and aggressively pushed her until Michael separated them. She also added that Evelyn pulled, kicked, and pushed her. In her statement, Hannah also recalled another altercation between her and Jennifer that occurred on March 17, 2021. During a soccer game, Jennifer approached her from behind again, grabbed her wrist sharply, pulled her towards her, and said, "I will make you hurt." The court reviewed Hannah's application in August 2021, and denied her the restraining order. It's not surprising, as she acted illogically. Why would she wait until mid-July if the attacks happened in March and June? Besides, she told the police two different versions of what happened. But the police are not her friends, they create an official report, and if she really wanted the judge to believe her and take her side, she should have stuck to one version. In any case, since 2021, the relationship between Hannah and Jennifer had remained tense, but outwardly everything seemed normal, and didn't involve law enforcement. Until that April morning in 2023. On April 25, 2023, the girls' paternal grandmother picked up Bella and Aria after their activities and took them out for a snack. Together, they visited the library and then brought lunch to their father at work. Later, the grandmother brought the girls back home, helped them take a bath, and put them to bed. She left her son's house at 7:30 p.m. and didn't notice any signs of imminent problems between Hannah and the children. According to the grandmother, if she had noticed anything, she wouldn't have left. The next confirmed information is that at around 9:30 p.m., Hannah left her home carrying a large plastic bucket from the side of the house. She loaded the bucket onto a cart, calmly wheeled it down the street, and left it in front of Jennifer's house. She then returned home with the cart. Shortly after, she came out again, buried some object in the yard of neighbors living a few houses away from her. Detectives later found out that it was Hannah's phone wrapped in a plastic bag. The phone had been buried, so the investigators couldn't trace its ping while looking for Hannah. However, after digging up the phone, they found out that just before burying the device, Hannah had been searching for a criminal defense attorney online. After that, she went to the police station, from where they took her to the hospital. By the time Michael Fontanelle returned home around 9:45 p.m., Bella's body was already in Jennifer's yard. He blamed himself severely for not checking his daughter's room when he returned home from work, even though he wouldn't have been able to help her at that point. Michael and Jennifer's neighbors were in shock from the incident. They remembered Bella, who often rode bikes with her sister on the street. They recalled her as a shy but friendly, well-mannered girl and couldn't believe that someone could put her body in a bucket. The fact that it was a 38-liter bucket fueled rumors of dismemberment, but the coroner refuted these rumors. He spoke at a press conference and stated that Bella's cause of death was manual strangulation, along with multiple blunt force injuries to the head. After her death, her lifeless body was placed in the bucket. Blood smears of Hannah were found on the bucket. She had a wound on her left hand. Blood was also discovered on the kitchen table, and in the backyard of Michael's house. Investigators are still examining the evidence related to the case. On June 29, 2023, a preliminary hearing took place, during which Hannah was charged with first-degree murder and obstruction of justice. Under Louisiana law, if found guilty, she could face the death penalty. At the moment, she is being held in custody without the possibility of bail. The motive in this case has not been revealed yet, but based on the history of Hannah's relationship with Jennifer, one can speculate that it might have been driven by revenge. Hannah placed the bucket in front of Jennifer's house, presumably hoping that Bella's mother would be the one to discover the body. It's unimaginable what emotions Jennifer must have experienced, thinking her children were safe and asleep while tragedy unfolded. As far as is known, there were no clear signs that Hannah was on the verge of a breakdown. Although the girls occasionally referred to Hannah as mean and expressed dissatisfaction with staying at their father's house, there is no evidence that she had ever harmed or threatened them. Michael always believed that Hannah loved the girls, especially Bella, but her hatred for Jennifer proved stronger than her love for Bella. And ultimately, Bella paid the price for something she had no connection to. According to the police, neither Michael nor Jennifer had any involvement in the crime, although it's likely that Hannah's lawyers will try to somehow implicate Michael in the incident. This is evident from the fact that during the preliminary hearing, Hannah's attorney presented a police report from 2019, in which Jennifer claimed that Michael had threatened her. Jennifer also accused the girl's father of holding a gun to her head when she was pregnant. It remains unclear how this information will help Hannah's defense. Perhaps she will attempt to argue that she committed the crime at Michael's instigation, or his cruelty pushed her into a nervous breakdown. But at this point, these are only speculations. On the Thursday following Bella's murder, a service was held, attended by over 600 people. On that day, the children were supposed to have outdoor competitions, but the activities were cancelled. Instead of allowing the kids to have fun and play outside, the parents had to explain to them what had happened and why Bella wouldn't be able to study with them anymore. Michael and Jennifer also attended the service and found the strength to talk to the children who had been in the same kindergarten as Bella, encouraging them despite the nightmare they were going through. Since all this happened at the end of April, it's likely that Bella's kindergarten had prepared and already distributed photographs of the future graduates to the parents, including Michael and Jennifer. It's difficult to imagine the agony of the girls' family as they looked at the pictures of Bella's graduation, knowing that she would never finish kindergarten, and would always be just 6 years old. Jennifer's sister, Bianca, wrote very touching words about her niece: "The world is so unfair. You were gifted to us for 6 amazing years. You were simply perfect. Your wonderful voice, cheerful nature, how you danced, how delicate and vulnerable you were, your smile, your laughter, the way you expressed yourself. I could talk endlessly about how amazing this little soul was." Christy Marceau woke up from a sudden phone call. The girl was sleeping in her room. It was 10 a.m. on Tuesday, September 6, 2011, and the 18-year-old student from the University of Technology in Auckland, New Zealand, didn't need to get up early. The phone stopped ringing before Christy picked up the receiver. But then, a few seconds later, it rang again. The girl answered. A male voice on the other end of the line asked to speak to Christy. "This is Christy," the girl said. It turned out that the caller was her acquaintance, Akshay-chan. Until recently, they both worked at a local supermarket. They weren't friends, but they sometimes talked at work and outside of it, exchanging messages on Facebook. They lived just a few blocks apart, and Akshay had come to Christy's house a few times. He often needed someone to talk to about his personal problems. Kind and compassionate, Christy was always ready to listen to him. The girl knew that Akshay had been going through a tough time lately, but she couldn't imagine what he would say next. Her heart sank when he uttered, "I dissolved 40 tablets in a drink, and if you don't come to my house within 10 minutes, I will drink it." Without a second thought, the girl hurried to help Akshay. Christy was in such a rush after Akshay's call that she had hardly any time to get dressed. She quickly put on sweatpants and a sweater over her sleepwear, grabbed her keys and mobile phone, jumped into her car, and drove about a kilometer to Akshay's house. It was unusual for Christy to ignore a cry for help. She always tried to assist those who had a harder time in life. Unlike the sociable Christy, Akshay-chan didn't have many friends. Everyone recognized his extraordinary intellect, but he found it difficult to communicate with other kids, especially girls. When fate brought them together at work in a local supermarket, Akshay began sharing his inner struggles with her. The girl sympathized with him, but in June 2011, she started a new job and saw Akshay much less frequently. By the time he called her on September 6, a considerable amount of time had passed since their last meeting. Christy had only 2 minutes to arrive at the apartment building where the guy lived with his mother and younger sister. She parked her car, rushed up the stairs, and knocked on the door. Akshay let her inside. Christy followed him through the entrance door, which he locked behind them. There was no one else at home. Akshay's mother was at work, and his 16-year-old sister was at school. As Christy sat down in a chair opposite him, she noticed a small amount of white powder on the table. It looked like someone had crushed tablets. Obviously, Chand hadn't lied when he mentioned the glass with the medication. Christy asked him where the drink was. "Do you think I'm that stupid?" He replied, "Of course, I hid it because I knew you would find it." Concerned, the girl tried to persuade Akshay to seek professional help. Her words disappointed him. From his perspective, Christy wasn't helping him cope with depression after she left the supermarket. Christy explained that she was torn between her university studies and her new job. But Chand argued that she could spare 5 minutes to chat with him on Facebook, and that would be enough. Then he added, "Let's face it, you weren't that busy." Christy became increasingly uneasy. The more he blamed her, the more she explained that she couldn't help him. He needed to reach out to a specialist. This angered Akshay even more. He jumped out of his chair and reached into his pocket for a kitchen knife. The knife was long and very sharp. Akshay held onto the handle tightly, brandishing it in front of Christy. "This is how we're going to do it," he said. "If you scream, I'll stab you with the knife." Christy began whimpering in response, prompting Chand to order her to be quiet and calm down. The girl still held onto her mobile phone, contemplating how to send a message to her friend asking for help. But Chand noticed the phone and demanded that she hand it over. Christy clung to her phone tightly, as if it were her only connection to the outside world. Failing to forcefully take the phone from her, Chand threatened the girl again, implying he would resort to using the weapon. He snatched the girl's mobile phone, and suddenly, Chand began to talk. He declared that he had big plans for the day. He decided to scare the girl, seek revenge on her for not supporting him during his most difficult period, and finally put an end to everything in one fell swoop. Then he demanded that Christy take off her sweater and hand it over to him. After searching through it, he demanded her blue top. The girl refused, but predictably, the guy threatened her with the knife. Christy complied. Then he ordered her to stand up and show that she wasn't hiding anything in her pants. She emptied her pockets, but it wasn't enough for him, and he wanted her to remove the sweatpants she was wearing. Christy refused and broke down in even greater tears. But realizing that she had no choice, she undressed, leaving herself only in her underwear. Chand crumpled her clothes into a pile, sat back in the chair, and began rambling about various things. He spouted nonsense about how people like Christy make others suffer. He accused her of coming to him only when it was already too late. Overall, more time had passed since Christy arrived at his place. Terrified, she asked if he planned to kill her. Chand reminded her of his plans for the day, to frighten her, seek revenge, and drink the prepared drink. He hadn't previously specified how he planned to seek revenge, but now he was ready to tell her. Akshay Chand wanted to violate Christy. Upon hearing this, the girl burst into tears, which prompted Chand to ask her to calm down. Then, out of the blue, he changed his mind. He returned Christy's clothes, phone, and told her she could leave. Still overwhelmed with fear, Christy initially didn't believe the sudden change in the guy's mood. What if he planned to stab her in the back, catching her off guard when she turned away? She shared her concerns with Chand, forcing him to lower the knife. "I'm letting you go, but you should know that as soon as you leave, I will drink the concoction," he said. Christy once again tried to persuade him to abandon this plan. Despite what he had put her through, her character didn't allow her to leave after such words. But Chand insisted. Too frightened to linger any longer, Christie turned around and ran out of the apartment. She hurried down the stairs to her car. Passers-by walked by, unaware of what had just happened to her. Christie wanted to ask one of them for help, but she realized she wouldn't feel safe until she reached home. Getting into her car, Christie locked the doors, started the engine, and drove home. From the perspective of Christie's parents, Brian and Tracy Marceau, she was their little miracle. After the birth of their first child, a girl named Heather, Tracy and Brian Marceau had been trying to become parents again. However, it took 6 years before Christie was born. By 2011, the very close-knit family members were living far apart. Heather had moved out of the family home a few years ago, and Brian was working in Australia. Tracy was planning to move to Australia soon to be closer to her husband. Christie was also looking forward to the move. As her first year at the University of Auckland's School of Hospitality and Tourism approached its end, where she was studying event management, she could continue her education in Australia. By the age of 30, the young woman dreamed of starting her own event planning company. Currently, she still lived in her parents' home, where she grew up in the suburb of Hillcrest. On the morning of the attack on Christie, Tracy was at work when her phone rang around 11:30 a.m. It was her mother, Shirley, who lived together with Tracy and Christie in the same house. Tracy answered, and in the background, she heard Christie's hysterical crying. Then she heard her mother's voice, telling her to come home immediately because Christie had been attacked. Tracy arrived home within 15 minutes. Upon seeing her mother, Christie threw herself into her arms and didn't want to let go. Trembling and crying incessantly, she recounted what Akshay Chand had done to her. Tracy hardly knew Akshay, but she remembered that once, while seeing off Brian at the airport, they returned home with their daughter and found him waiting at the doorstep. Akshay and Christie chatted briefly. Christie assured her mother that she just needed someone to talk to, but Tracy didn't like him right away. He evoked a strange feeling in her, and she asked her daughter to stop communicating with him. However, the girl was confident that there was nothing to worry about, and Tracy had never heard of Akshay again until this incident. Shocked by the details of what had happened, Tracy immediately took her daughter to the police station. In the police station, Christie repeated her account of the attack. She didn't know why Akshay had a change of heart and let her go, but she was certain that it wasn't the end and that he would attack her again because he had been stalking her for some time. She didn't tell her parents that she had found him sitting on the steps of her house on more than one occasion. At one point, he left a note for her in the mailbox, confessing his love and thanking her for the support she had provided, which he desperately needed. Chand also insisted that Christie accept a large sum of money as a gift. She took the money but didn't spend it, believing that he would demand it back. And indeed, a few days later, he did. When she left work at the supermarket, Chand quit his job on the same day, stating that he had no reason to stay there without her. After that, their communication ceased, and it became evident that Akshay had built up a lot of anger towards Christie, believing that she had abandoned him. The thought of him being out there frightened her, and the police recognized the danger she faced. As a result, Akshay Chand was promptly placed under arrest. Akshay admitted to everything and stated that the drink he threatened to consume contained multivitamins. However, he genuinely believed that consuming them in large quantities was toxic. In the police station, he calmly explained that his motive was revenge. Chand was angry at Christie because she didn't help him with his depression, and he openly expressed that he still harbored thoughts of vengeance. The police were extremely concerned about his behavior. It was a significant leap from someone who had never had any issues with the law to a criminal charged with abduction, attempted sexual assault, and threats of harm. Since he was still angry at Christie, the detectives knew it was crucial to keep Chand in custody until he could appear in court. They prepared a document outlining the reasons why Chand should not be released on bail, emphasizing Christie's fear and the proximity of their homes. They highlighted the fact that he could appear at her doorstep within minutes if he desired. 3 days after the attack, Akshay appeared in court. His lawyer argued that her client should be released on bail because he was only 18 years old. According to the law at that time, individuals over 17 but under 20 years old were typically eligible for bail if they had no prior convictions. Since Chand had never been arrested before, his lawyer claimed that he should be granted bail. She promised that he would take antidepressant medication, and if released on bail, his family would supervise him. However, the judge believed that it was not appropriate to release a person who had shown unwavering determination to carry out his actions. Despite the law, the judge stated that the only circumstance in which she would consider granting bail was if Chand agreed to be admitted to a psychiatric hospital. However, this option was unlikely. Therefore, the judge decided to defer the bail decision, and requested a psychiatric evaluation for Akshay. Throughout this time, Christie continued to suffer. Her father was scheduled to return from Australia in a week, and she convinced her family not to inform him about what had happened so that he could continue working without worry. Initially, she was afraid not only to travel in public transportation but even to sleep in her own room. Whenever she heard any sound at night, she immediately asked her family to check what it was. Her greatest fear was that Akshay would be released and would attack her family or fixate on another innocent girl. By early November, life began to slowly improve. Chand was scheduled to appear in court on Wednesday, November 9th, and in 2 months, Christie and her family would be living in Australia. The relocation, which was initially meant to mark the beginning of an exciting new chapter in their lives, now became an urgent necessity. On the morning of November 7th, Tracy got up at 6:30, and began preparing for her workday. She let the dogs out, made breakfast, and took a shower. As she was getting dressed, she heard a knock on the door. It was still early, around 7 a.m., but Tracy wasn't surprised by the knock. Christie loved shopping online, and her orders were usually delivered in the morning. While Christie was still asleep, getting some rest before her late shift at work, Tracy went to answer the door herself. There was a young man standing on the porch. Tracy didn't recognize him immediately, but then she realized it was Akshay Chanda. He was holding a knife. Tracy felt fear grip her as Chanda forced his way into her home. She screamed as loudly as she could, hoping that Christie would hear and understand that something terrible was happening and have time to escape. Or maybe the neighbors would hear and come to their aid. Still threatening Tracy with the knife, Chanda asked who else was in the house. Tracy lied and said her husband was home. That was not true. He had already returned to Australia. He had wanted to leave work, but the police convinced him that his family would be safe. But somehow Chanda seemed to know this, which made Tracy suspect he had been watching them for some time. Suddenly, Christie appeared on the stairs near Tracy and Chanda. Barefoot and in her sleepwear, she was awakened by her mother's scream and went upstairs to find out what was happening. When she saw Chanda, Christie screamed. Frozen with fear, she stood at the top of the stairs, unable to move. Chanda continued to direct the knife at Tracy, slowly advancing toward Christie. Then he kicked her in the chest, causing her to tumble down the stairs. Christie got up, ran down the steps, but slipped in her haste and fell again. She then got up and ran through her grandmother's room and into the backyard. Chanda chased after her. Meanwhile, Tracy called the police. Given what Chanda had done previously, she thought he might be trying to scare Christie again. She was confident that Christie would be able to lock herself in her grandmother's room, and Chanda wouldn't be able to reach her. The police were aware of the situation. They would be there within a few minutes and arrest Chanda. Tracy dialed emergency services. But before she could provide her address, she heard a frantic scream. It was Christie. Tracy dropped the phone and ran downstairs. Christie lay on the porch in the backyard, with a pool of blood spreading beneath her. Chanda stood nearby. Tracy rushed to her daughter and embraced her. She couldn't see any wounds, but Christie couldn't move. It seemed difficult for her to breathe. Tracy repeatedly told her daughter that she loved her and begged her to hold on because help was on the way. It seemed to Tracy that Christie was trying to say something to her. Looking into her eyes, Tracy saw that life had just left them. Christie was gone. Chanda just stood there. When Tracy looked at him, she saw that he still held the knife. The blade was bent at a 90-degree angle. Chanda himself was covered in blood. Showing no concern about what might happen to her next, Tracy screamed that he had killed Christie. With a completely emotionless voice, he replied, "I'm glad." The police arrived less than 10 minutes after the attack began. Chanda was still in the backyard, listening to music on an iPad. The broken knife lay on the ground. An officer asked what he was doing there. Chanda replied, "Retribution." Another officer noticed that Chanda's hands were trembling and asked why. He responded, "It's not easy to kill someone, is it?" Chanda was arrested and taken to the police station. Tracy had the difficult task of informing Heather and Brian about what had just happened to Christie. The Marceau family had been convinced that something like this would happen ever since Chanda was released on bail a month earlier. Initially, the judge denied his release, citing the need for further information about the case and the defendant's health condition. However, since he qualified for bail under the law, his lawyer quickly filed 2 applications for release. Chanda wrote a letter to the new judge, David McNaughton, expressing remorse for the attack on Christie. He stated that he deeply regretted what he had put the girl through and, given the opportunity, he would apologize to her and her family. Christie also wrote a letter to the judge, pleading not to release Akshay. She believed that since he had nothing to lose, he would attempt to attack her again. On October 5, the judge granted Chanda bail, despite reading Christie's letter and being aware that the police also believed it was right to keep him behind bars. Chanda was allowed to return to his home, which was located just 350 meters away from Christie's house, in a straight line. The police were extremely disappointed but assured the Marceau family that they would protect them. Officers promised to check on Chanda at various times of the day, making sure he was at home. All the officers patrolling the area were informed about the case. Overall, the police visited Chanda 23 times in the 32 days he was free, and each time he was at home. Despite the police assurances, Christie's fears grew. And after 32 days, he showed up at her doorstep with a knife. Forensic experts investigating the scene of her death found the knife Chanda used to stab her 10 to 15 times before it bent 90 degrees and became useless. He attacked her from behind, delivering a powerful blow to the back of her head. She fell to the floor, where Chanda continued to strike her on the back. One wound was so severe that Christie almost felt nothing afterwards. In the police station, Chanda was surprisingly calm and immediately confessed to everything. Despite suddenly releasing Christie on one occasion, he had never let go of his desire for revenge, and in prison, he started plotting her murder. Knowing that he needed to escape from prison to carry out his plan, he feigned remorse by writing a sympathetic letter to the judge. While free, he didn't waste any time and waited, knowing that Christie and her family would be protected by the police. Although the judge believed that Chanda's family would keep an eye on him throughout the day, his mother worked long hours, and his sister was too young for such a role. She was scared of him herself. All his mother could do was keep kitchen knives away from him, but Chanda knew what she had in mind and hid one of them. On November 7th, he woke up at 6:30, knowing that the day had come. In 2 days, he was scheduled to appear in court, and Christie probably believed that she was safe. The investigators were confident that Akshay would be found guilty on all charges, since he had confessed to everything. However, they were surprised when he decided to plead not guilty by reason of insanity. Several experts, including one hired by his defense and 2 from the prosecution, evaluated him. Akshay told them that he had been hearing a persistent female voice for some time, especially in the mornings. He claimed that the voice ordered him to kill Christie and wished for her mother's death. Although initially Akshay could resist the voice's influence, he eventually succumbed to it. After consultations with psychiatrists and starting medication, He didn't express remorse for the murder but acknowledged that he would have to live with the knowledge of what he had done. It was incredibly difficult for Christie's parents to come to terms with the medical assessment. Tracy, in particular, struggled. She regretted opening the door to the killer and couldn't forget the last moments of Christie's life. "All I see, all I will ever see, is my daughter lying on my lap, gasping for air, covered in blood, dying for some senseless reason. He just stood there and watched, he didn't even attempt to escape. What kind of person does that?" She demanded punishment for Akshay, but the psychiatrist explained to her that Akshay's symptoms, previously attributed to depression, could now be explained by schizophrenia. Moreover, when depression is treated with medication, symptoms of schizophrenia can become more pronounced. During the first attack, the illness was in its early stage, and he managed to understand that harming the girl would be wrong, so he let her go. However, during the second incident, when he came for her, he was aware of what he was doing, but his illness prevented him from understanding that it was morally unacceptable. Akshay couldn't be tried for murder, but he was found guilty of kidnapping and attempted sexual assault. However, he would still serve his punishment in a psychiatric facility. He would only be released if he ceased to pose a danger to society, but his chances of recovery were extremely slim. The Marceau family relocated to Adelaide, Australia, but they didn't allow Christie's murder to become just another crime statistic. If Akshay had not been released on bail after the first crime, Christie would have moved to Australia and lived happily. Therefore, they started a campaign to change the bail laws. Thanks in part to their efforts, since 2013, defendants are required to prove that they are not a threat to society, instead of the police having to prove the opposite as it was before.
Witchcraft. It instilled superstitious fear and evoked thoughts of supernatural beings, instilling terror in people's imaginations. The inhabitants of the infamous Salem succumbed to superstitions and fears and embarked on a witch hunt. Innocent women were taken from their homes and accused of the gravest of evils. By the time the residents of Salem regained their senses, 24 of their neighbors had been hanged in the town square. However, 3 centuries later, witchcraft not only thrives in Salem, but also aids in the fight against evil. Although Salem once echoed with the cries of innocent women subjected to inhumane torture, for several centuries it had been nothing more than a quiet tourist and fishing town, until one sunny summer day when its peace and quiet were shattered by the screams of a young woman. Martha Laurel Conant moved to Salem in the late 1980s because her ancestor was Roger Conant, the one credited with founding the town. Additionally, she loved the Willow district of Salem as she had always dreamt of living by the ocean. Martha had a deep passion for sea voyages, and when she married Brian Brailsford, a cruise ship captain who shared her enthusiasm, it was evident to all that their union was destined. Since the company's ships, where Brian worked, sailed from Boston to Provincetown, there were countless days during their 9 years of marriage when Brian had to stay overnight. But for the first time, when he returned home on Friday, July 12, 1991, Martha was not there. It was clear that she had been missing for a while. The house had no lights on, even though it was getting dark, and Martha hadn't brought her painting inside, which she had been working on outside. Brian waited for a while, gradually becoming more anxious. He tried to figure out where she could be. Martha worked as an interior designer, and her work wouldn't have urgently called her in. She was so punctual and consistent in her habits that you could set your watch by her. So, her sudden absence from home alarmed Brian. Martha's twin sister didn't know where she was either. Local hospitals hadn't admitted his wife. Therefore, at 1 in the morning, he called the police, but they told him not to worry and to wait a little longer. The police believed that there might be a completely innocent reason for the 37-year-old woman not returning home, as there were no signs of abduction or any other crime. Unable to calm down, Brian took a flashlight and decided to walk along Martha's usual route, thinking that she might have twisted her ankle or fallen and hit her head. Brian searched for her for several hours in the parks, on the beach, everywhere she liked to stroll. With the dawn, he went out to search again, but there was no sign of his wife anywhere. Brian searched his wife's acquaintances in his memory, trying to remember if she had mentioned anyone, and he did recall that on Friday morning she had gone for a walk with Thomas Maimone. Thomas Maimone had only moved to Salem the previous December and remained a mysterious figure to many townsfolk. He had met Martha during their regular morning dog walks. When the clock struck 7, Brian decided it was appropriate to visit Thomas. Finding him not at home, he headed to the yacht club, where he noticed his 28-foot yacht, Counterpoint. But Thomas was not on it. Finally, around 8 in the morning, he managed to find Thomas at home. Brian greeted Thomas and introduced himself as Martha's husband. He explained that his wife had gone missing, and as far as he knew, they had been walking together the previous morning. Thomas confirmed this, but said that later she had met some friends and left with them. Brian asked if he had offered Martha to go for a yacht ride with him. Thomas replied that he hadn't been on the yacht at all on Friday and would never have suggested a boat ride to Martha. He assured Brian that instead he would have invited him to join them and had invited his own girlfriend. Brian knew that Thomas had recently lost his wife to cancer. Martha, being a very kind and compassionate woman, had sympathized with the grieving widower and tried to lift his spirits during their walks. So when Thomas casually mentioned that he would have invited his girlfriend for a yacht ride, a vague sense of unease crept into Brian's mind. On Saturday, Brian finally managed to persuade the police to investigate his wife's disappearance, and Salem detective Konrad Prosniewski took on the case. Detective Prosniewski spoke with Thomas, who insisted that he had last seen Martha at 7 in the morning on Friday. They hadn't been on his yacht, and he wouldn't have invited a married woman for a boat ride because rumors could spread. However, in such a small town, it didn't take the police long to establish that Martha had indeed been on his yacht on Friday around 1 p.m. at the Willows Pier. Over the weekend, Thomas was leaving town, and on Monday, July 15th, Detective Prosniewski went to his house again for a second round of questioning. To his surprise, a woman who introduced herself as Patricia Maimone, Thomas's wife, answered the door. It turned out that Thomas was not a widower, and his wife genuinely believed he was the perfect husband. But Thomas had not only lied about his marital status. When pressed by the detective, after a short pause, he admitted that Martha had boarded his yacht, but he thought she would come with her husband. Almost immediately, Martha had disembarked and continued her walk, while Thomas had anchored near the yacht club, where he stayed until 6 p.m. before returning home. Investigating Thomas's story, the police found a witness, Dr. Ronald Plotka, a dentist who had been Martha Brailsford's dentist for the past 10 years. He stated that he was on the coast, Winter Island Landing, from noon to 2 p.m. and did not see Martha. However, he claimed that if a woman had disembarked on the shore, he would have definitely noticed her. Detective Prosniewski had to speak with Thomas once again. Thomas initially tried to stick to his previous story, but upon learning about the dentist's testimony, he offered yet another version of the events from Friday, which was now the third version. He claimed that he and Martha had sailed the yacht all the way to Gloucester. As sunset approached, they turned back towards Salem. However, the front sail got tangled, and when Martha tried to help, a strong wave hit the yacht, causing the woman to hit her head on the mast. She attempted to grab onto the sail but couldn't hold on and fell into the water. Thomas asserted that Martha had drowned before he could assist her. He admitted that he hadn't contacted the Coast Guard because he was afraid Patricia, his wife who was visiting her mother in Kansas, would find out that a woman had been on his yacht. As Martha was an excellent swimmer who could cover long distances if needed, her relatives and acquaintances thoroughly searched all nearby beaches, various coves, and small islands where she might have ended up after falling overboard. The residents of the small town knew and loved Martha because she was a very kind, compassionate, and friendly woman. Therefore, many rushed to join in the search efforts. However, despite their best efforts, 5 days after she was last seen, Martha remained unfound. Desperate for any leads, investigators turned to an unconventional source of information, Salem's official witch, Lori Cabot. The police hoped that by using her abilities, she could help narrow down the search area. Lori asked for a photo of the missing woman and, entering a trance-like state, saw Martha on a yacht with a man. The man wasted no time and began to make advances towards his companion, becoming increasingly insistent. When met with rejection, he turned into a savage beast and started beating Martha. While she lay unconscious, the man tied an anchor to her ankle and fastened a heavy diving belt around her waist before heartlessly tossing her overboard. Lori assured the police that Martha's body was still attached to the anchor and submerged underwater. She even pinpointed the location where they would find her, near a small island with a visible lighthouse. The police understood that Lori had painted a quite realistic picture of what might have happened to Martha. They also had no doubt that Thomas Maimone continued to lie to them, but they lacked the evidence for his arrest. As the saying goes, no body, no case. And there was a significant likelihood that they might never find Martha. However, everything changed when they were called to a harbor about 10 minutes away from Salem. Early on Thursday morning, lobster fisherman William Hooper Goodwin began setting his traps near the southeastern beach of one of Salem's islands, Children's Island. When the last trap surfaced, the fisherman noticed an anchor tangled in it. Along with the anchor, a 4-meter rope was pulled up to the surface, attached to a human ankle. The body was naked, and after spending several days at the bottom of the ocean, it had almost turned into a skeleton. Nevertheless, it was quickly determined that it was Martha Brailsford. Just as Lori had predicted, she was discovered near a small island with a visible lighthouse, and she was attached to an anchor and a heavy belt. When Martha visited the dentist 3 months before her death, her teeth were in excellent condition. She took great care of them, and after a post-mortem examination revealed damage to her 2 lower teeth, it became clear that she had received several severe blows shortly before her death. However, despite the signs of injury on her body, the forensic expert concluded that Martha died after being thrown into the water. The heavy anchor attached to Martha's ankle spoke volumes to the investigators, and it was enough to arrest Thomas for her murder. However, he disappeared. Evidently, he had heard rumors that Martha had been found and realized that authorities would come for him. It didn't occur to the detective that he might flee because he had never evaded police contact before. Unfortunately, they were only 10 minutes late. Once again, the detectives turned to Lori for assistance. Immersed in a trance, she managed to see Thomas standing in front of a mirror, shaving off his mustache. She sensed that he was scared, didn't know where to go, and was contemplating heading southwest or north. Eventually, he decided to flee to Canada. Providing all this information to the police, Lori thought there might be something more she could do. She decided to cast a binding spell on Thomas to disrupt his plans. Creating a straw doll and binding it with a cord, she named it Thomas, and wished for him to make a foolish mistake that would lead to his capture. 3 days later, a police officer from a small town on the Canadian border responded to a call from local residents. They had noticed an unfamiliar car near a cabin that was supposed to be vacant. When the police officers arrived on the scene, they found signs of a break-in, and inside, a man who was peacefully sleeping on the couch. The intruder turned out to be Thomas Maimone. Just as Lori had predicted, he had shaved his mustache and intended to cross the border into Canada. It's hard to argue that he had made a significant mistake by breaking into that cabin and staying there until neighbors noticed his car and called the police. Now, instead of a new life in Canada, he faced a trial in Massachusetts. After Thomas Maimone's arrest, other women came forward to the police, sharing that they had also been on Thomas's yacht, sympathizing with the charming widower. However, when left alone with the women, he would suddenly drop his facade of friendliness and become rather aggressively forward. One woman even admitted that she would prefer to jump overboard and attempt to swim to shore than stay with him on the yacht. These women didn't file complaints at the time because they wanted to forget the unpleasant incidents and were afraid of gossip, which was common in a small town. Due to the rumors circulating about Thomas, his lawyers requested a change of venue for the trial, hoping to move it to another town. However, the judge denied this request, believing that the jurors could disregard the rumors and get to the bottom of the story. As a result, the trial took place in Salem, and a significant moment occurred when Thomas Maimone was brought into the courtroom. A court stenographer immediately rose from her seat and stated that she couldn't continue her work because the defendant had been making inappropriate advances toward her. Following this, 2 female jurors also recalled his advances and could potentially be biased against the defendant. This partly reflects the size of Salem, but it also indicates that Thomas Maimone had not spared any skirt. In February 1993, Thomas Maimone stood trial. During the trial, Tom presented another version of the events of Friday, July 12, 1991. According to him, he and Martha were on the yacht, drifting away from the shore. There was no sexual undertone, quarrels, or fights. At sunset, as they were heading back home, high waves, possibly caused by trawlers in the distance, hit the yacht. Martha hit her head on the mast, and the next wave that swept over the yacht threw her overboard. Tom saw her in the water but couldn't make eye contact with her, so he didn't throw a life buoy. Instead, he attempted to turn the yacht by positioning the boarding ladder closer to her, but she didn't grab onto it. Thomas then went down himself and, with great effort, lifted Martha onto the deck. To prevent her from getting hypothermia, he took off her clothes and wrapped her in towels, but he realized it was too late to save her. In a panic and fearing that Patricia, his wife, who was visiting his mother in Kansas, would find out about the woman on his yacht, he decided to dispose of Martha. Thomas attached an anchor and a diving belt to her and threw her overboard near Children's Island. He returned home after midnight. This was Tom's version of events. However, the prosecution painted a completely different picture. Thomas Maimone had lied about everything. He lied about his job as an engineer, his education, and even the qualifications he supposedly possessed. Although Patricia considered herself his second wife, Thomas Maimone had actually been married 4 times. His true second wife had indeed battled cancer but had recovered, and he didn't lose any of his wives due to this terrible illness. Nonetheless, he enjoyed portraying himself as a grieving widower to gain sympathy and achieve his lowly goals. Thomas invited women onto his yacht, where they had few ways to escape, and Martha fell into this trap as well. Realizing that Martha was what he truly wanted, she rejected him. But that didn't stop him. He likely became too aggressive, and fearing that rumors would reach Patricia and his house of cards would collapse, he made the conscious decision to kill Martha. Thomas beat her unconscious. Whether he took advantage of her vulnerability is unknown due to the state of her body not allowing such judgment. In any case, he tied an anchor and a diving belt to the unconscious woman and threw her overboard. It's horrifying to think that the last thing she saw might have been his face. She had gone on a yacht ride with a friend on a beautiful summer day, and suddenly, this scene unfolded. On February 12, 1993, Thomas Maimone was found guilty of second-degree murder and sentenced to life in prison. The parole board denied his release several times because he turned every meeting into a farce, portraying himself as a victim and claiming that he had developed post-traumatic stress disorder from Martha's murder. He passed away in prison on October 18, 2017, never admitting his guilt in Martha Brailsford's murder. It can be argued endlessly whether Laurie Cabot truly helped the police or if her role in solving the case has been exaggerated. Nevertheless, it's reassuring to know that the Salem police were willing to explore all avenues of obtaining information to solve the crime. In particular, investigators did not miss the opportunity to turn to Laurie again during the investigation of the mysterious disappearance of 33-year-old Gail Knowlton. In January 1992, the woman left her home to go to work and was never seen again. She left behind her disabled husband and a 16-month-old son. Laurie Cabot entered a trance again and saw that when Gail left her home that morning, she encountered a familiar man who offered her a ride. The woman was glad to see him. They were joking and laughing. But suddenly he produced a knife and began teasing Gail with it. The man drove her to a secluded road in another state, Dolly Comp Road in Mount Washington, New Hampshire, and ordered her to get out of the car. Leading Gail to a steep slope, he pushed her down and simply drove away. Laurie described the location where everything happened, the man's car, and suggested that he might be somehow involved with illicit substances. Whether everything happened as Laurie saw it in her trance is unknown. Most likely not, as Gail Knowlton was never found, nor was the driver of the car who supposedly took her on her final journey. When 5-year-old Shania, peacefully sleeping next to her older brother, was awakened in the middle of the night, the girl didn't understand what was happening. Of course, she recognized the man looming over her. She had seen him in the house many times, but this time, everything was different. The girl couldn't know that her mother had just sold her to a friend for a debt of $200. The entire country was following the high-profile case of the disappearance of the 5-year-old child from North Carolina, and the horrifying video that surfaced confirmed that the girl had been abducted from her own bed before enduring the most terrifying hours of her life. In 2003, Bradley Lockhart was going through an extremely difficult period in his life. 5 years prior, his beloved wife tragically passed away. She and her younger sister became victims of a triple homicide when robbers broke into their friend's house upon learning that one of the family members had received a large insurance payout. The victims were silenced with gags, and all were shot. Fortunately, 2 of them survived. After the death of his wife, Bradley single-handedly raised their children. But in 2003, he began to slowly open himself up to new relationships. At a party, he met Antoinette Davis. Their romance was very short-lived, but soon Bradley found out that Antoinette was pregnant. His joy knew no bounds when on June 14, 2004, his daughter Shania came into the world. The girl regularly visited her father, and since 2006, when Antoinette had financial and substance abuse problems, and Bradley had just bought a big house, Shania moved in with him and his other 4 children. The girl quickly became the darling of the family. She loved playing basketball with her brother and riding her scooter. She also wanted to sing in the church choir. As Bradley often had to leave for business trips, his sister helped him with raising the children. Such was the situation until 2009, when Antoinette informed Bradley that she was slowly getting back on her feet, had sorted out her financial issues, found housing, and was ready to take care of their daughter again. It seemed to him that she was speaking sincerely, and he decided to give her a chance. Nevertheless, in the early autumn of 2009, 5-year-old Shania moved in with her mother and her 7-year-old brother, Carlo. The family lived in a trailer park in Fayetteville, North Carolina, which was rented by Antoinette's sister, Brenda Davis. The trailer was quite cramped because Brenda, her children, and her boyfriend Jeroy Smith lived in the back room, while Antoinette and her 2 children occupied the front. Nevertheless, little Shania loved her mom and brother very much and was happy to live with them and her aunt. And on November 10, 2009, at 5:30 a.m., when the whole family was asleep, Brenda woke up to a noise. She thought the door of the trailer had opened. She woke her boyfriend and told him, but neither of them got up to see what was happening. They fell back asleep, but half an hour later they were woken up by Antoinette. She asked if they had seen Shania. Of course, they hadn't. So the mother went outside to look for her daughter. While she was outside, Shania's brother, Carlo, mentioned that he had seen Mono in the trailer that night. The adults clarified if the boy was sure, and he said yes. Mario Andret McNeil, known as Mono, was Brenda's ex-boyfriend. He had helped her with the first payment for the trailer rent in which she lived, and while they were dating, they spent a lot of time in the trailer. He knew Antoinette and her children, and also knew how to get inside, even if the door was locked. Therefore, Brenda didn't immediately dismiss the boy's words and tried to contact Mono, but he didn't answer. Mono's girlfriend also didn't know where he was. When Brenda and her boyfriend went outside, they noticed excrement on the trailer steps and rails. It hadn't been there the previous evening. It was both strange and frightening. Meanwhile, Antoinette returned. She said she had knocked on the doors of the other trailers, but no one had seen her daughter. Brenda advised her sister to call the police immediately, but for some reason, Antoinette hesitated. Later that same morning, about 6 hours after the incident, a car stopped at a hotel in Sanford, North Carolina, about an hour's drive north of Fayetteville. A man got out, walked into the hotel, presented his documents at the front desk, and checked into the hotel under his own name, Mario McNeil. Yes, it was Mono. He told the clerk that he was traveling with his daughter and taking her to her mother in Virginia. Surveillance cameras captured Mono returning to the parking lot, carrying a child wrapped in a blue blanket. The hotel receptionist only saw the little girl's thick, curly hair as she was bundled up. Mono didn't hide, calmly carrying the child to room 201. On his way, he encountered another guest, but this didn't seem to faze him. Shortly after, Mono went down for breakfast just as the new shift started at the hotel. He took a banana, juice, and a muffin, and carried the food back to his room. The clerk who interacted with Mono drew her shift manager's attention to him. Meanwhile, at the insistence of her sister, Antoinette called the police at 6:52 a.m. She told the operator that the girl had gone to bed as usual, and around 5 a.m., she saw her sleeping, but suddenly her daughter was missing. Antoinette added that the trailer door was closed, but Shania knew how to open it. 10 minutes after the call, officers arrived. They immediately began the search, questioning neighbors and bringing in search dogs. The police also noticed something that would later be identified as feces on the porch rails and steps. However, they looked as if something had been poured on them. When an officer arrived, Antoinette was holding a pot. Evidently, she had poured boiling water or liquid on the rails. In a nearby trash can, they found a blanket that Antoinette identified as hers, and her sister's boyfriend added that it had been in the living room in the trailer. It was a child's blanket, and it also had feces on it. Officers spoke with all the family members. Shania's brother Carlo kept looking at his aunt while answering the police's questions. He remembered when his sister went to bed but didn't recall how she left the bedroom. As Brenda and Antoinette were constantly looking at their phones and scribbling something, and overall couldn't focus on the questions, the police took them to the station. The officers went to the main office of the trailer park to view the surveillance cameras to see if they could spot the child wandering around the trailer park or any cars passing by. At 7:34 a.m., the hotel surveillance cameras captured Mano leaving room 201 and heading to the elevator with the child in his arms. He exited the hotel building through a side door. A janitor was there, picking up cigarette butts and other debris when he saw Mano. The child was covered, and the janitor assumed she was asleep. He greeted Mano, who glanced at him, turned away, and walked silently. The janitor felt something was off and tried to keep an eye on Mano, but discreetly. After putting the child in the right rear passenger seat, Mano sat in the driver's seat and lit a cigarette. The janitor continued to observe, pretending to work, as something seemed amiss. After finishing his cigarette, Mano drove up to the hotel's main entrance and went inside. He told the clerk at the front desk that it was time for him to hit the road and take his daughter to her mother, asking for his deposit back. After receiving the deposit, the man left through the main entrance and got into his car at 7:40 a.m., then turned left onto the highway. Phone records showed that around 7:49 a.m. the same morning, Mano sent a message to Brenda, apparently noticing her attempts to reach out to him. At that time, she was giving her statement at the police station. Brenda and Mano exchanged several messages. Brenda wanted to know what he was doing at her house, but the man denied visiting her. Brenda then asked him not to message her anymore. She didn't inform the police that she was texting with Mano while at the station because she didn't want to draw any conclusions at that moment. For the same reason, she didn't mention that Shania's brother had seen Mano at the trailer. After the guest from room 201 checked out, the housekeeper was cleaning and found small packets containing residues of a white substance, which she showed to the clerk at the front desk. She suspected it was illegal substances. However, neither the clerks nor the hotel cleaner took any action, despite something about the guest's behavior bothering them. Only when the new day arrived and the hotel staff saw a police broadcast on the computer about the missing girl did they notice the similarity with the child the previous guest had been carrying. They immediately called the hotline. The police arrived promptly. It is often the case in such situations that the hotel cameras are not working or provide little help, but not this time. After reviewing the footage, the detectives concluded that Shania was indeed with Mano, and most importantly, she was still alive. As soon as the news of the child's disappearance became known, FBI agents joined the case. They focused on analyzing Mano's phone. After questioning the hotel cleaner and analyzing the ping from his phone, the FBI agents recommended that the police search for Shania in the area around Highway 87. Many volunteers also rushed to search for the girl. Meanwhile, forensic experts examined room 201. Although the towels had already been replaced and the trash had been taken out, the bed linen had not been changed yet. After the video from the hotel became known, in the evening of November 12th, Brenda and her boyfriend informed the police that Shania's brother had seen Mano in the trailer on the night the girl disappeared. Brenda explained that she hadn't revealed this earlier because she didn't want to jump to conclusions. Now, she showed the conversation with him and recalled overhearing a conversation between Antoinette and Mano after the girl's disappearance. Mano was trying to say something to Antoinette, but she replied, "I have nothing to say to you. I just want to know where the heck my child is." Then Mano said, "Fine," got into the car and quickly drove away. Brenda began to suspect that Antoinette had lied about what she knew. The sisters had an argument and didn't speak to each other afterward. Examining the chain of events leading to Shania's disappearance, the police doubted Antoinette's story and called her in for questioning again. Under pressure, she claimed that her boyfriend, Clarence Coe, had abducted the girl. The police questioned him but quickly released him after reviewing the hotel video. Additionally, the man had an alibi. Finally, the mother confessed that Mano had taken the girl from the trailer. The police were perplexed. In other words, Shania's family didn't know where the girl had disappeared to, but now it turned out that she had been with, one could say, a longtime family friend. Questioning the woman was incredibly difficult because she was trying to change her testimony. The officers contacted Mano and asked him to come to the station. The police also found his Mitsubishi Galant, which was far from his home on Washington Drive. The police searched the car trunk and then took the car to the station. The car was subsequently examined for forensic evidence. Starting around 9:30 p.m. on the evening of November 12th, several officers interrogated Mano, hoping that he would reveal where Shania was. Although she had been considered missing for 2 days, the officers still hoped to find her alive. They did not handcuff him, take his phone, or detain him. On the contrary, they emphasized that he could leave at any moment. Mono admitted that he was in the trailer park after midnight on November 10th. Initially, he denied entering Brenda's trailer, seeing Shania, or even knowing who she was. He denied that she was in his car, as well as that he stopped with her at the hotel. He continued to deny everything, even when shown surveillance camera footage and informed that his name and address were indicated in the hotel registry. Mono evaded answers for some time, but eventually admitted that he was at the hotel with Shania. Suddenly, his story changed and became very strange. Allegedly, Brenda sent him a message inviting him to come and pick up Shania on the trailer porch. He picked up Shania and took her to the hotel room where he consumed drugs. Then unknown people contacted him by phone, asking him to bring Shania to the specified address. Mono said that he delivered the girl to these people. The tone of the interrogation became completely different when Mono suddenly claimed that he was waiting for a call to come and kill her. The officers tried to persuade him to tell more about it, but he refused. Of course, neither Brenda's nor Mono's phones had any such messages or calls from unknown people, only the correspondence that Brenda had already shown to the investigators. At the end of the interrogation, Mono was arrested on charges of kidnapping Shania. At that time, they did not yet know that, but upon reviewing the interrogation video, they saw that when Mono was alone in the room for questioning, he approached the outlet, sat down on the floor next to it, took out a key, and inserted it into the outlet. Then he took off his shoes and repeated the same actions. Obviously, he wanted to be electrocuted, which could indicate that Mono was in distress after his role in some heinous crime. Nevertheless, extensive searches for Shania continued along Highway 87. However, it was easier said than done. It is the second longest highway in the country, spanning 386,000 kilometers, essentially dividing North Carolina in half. Additionally, as the highway is actively used, repair work is constantly ongoing. But on the morning of November 13th, the district attorney informed the detectives working on the case that Mono's lawyer might have useful information for them. The attorney indeed suggested that in the course of the search, they should look for green portable toilets along the highway. However, this lead did not prove to be very helpful. Subsequently, the lawyer advised the officers to find a spot where hunters gut their game. Around 1 p.m. on November 16th, the search team found Shania's body partially concealed under a log in an area where deer bones lay. She was only in her underwear and appeared to be wearing a black hoodie that was much too large for her. Mono was charged with murder. Thanks to the evidence, autopsy results, and witness testimonies, the events of that fateful night when Shania was abducted were reconstructed. Despite living with the woman who had given him a daughter 18 months earlier, Mono continued to interact closely with other women. On the evening of November 9th, Mono drank and consumed illicit substances. He desired female companionship and began messaging multiple female acquaintances on his phone. He attempted to contact Brenda, but her phone was turned off. He then messaged another woman who also lived in the trailer park near Brenda. The woman was not opposed to keeping him company, but when he showed up at her door around 3 a.m., she had already fallen asleep and did not answer. At 3:06, he messaged her, wishing her a good night, and once again attempted to pursue Brenda. However, she was sleeping in the far room, and instead, Antoinette intercepted him. It is important to note that Mono had once lent Antoinette $200 so she could buy food and stay in a hotel with her children when she had nowhere to live. Some sources claimed the debt was related to illicit substances, but this was false. These rumors were debunked by the district attorney. However, under the influence of illegal substances, Mono lost all his nobility. He wanted something in return from Antoinette, money or female companionship, which he desperately craved. It is uncertain how the conversation unfolded, but ultimately, Antoinette sold her 5-year-old daughter to work off her debt to him. Judging from the feces found on the trailer's stairs and a blanket, something had already happened to Shania before Mono took her out of the trailer. Afterward, the man drove with his victim to the hotel, where he obtained what he desired once again. He then strangled her and left her body near the highway, where it was later found. Antoinette was also arrested but released on a $51,000 bond. She claimed in her defense he was only supposed to have intimacy with her, not kill her. On July 5, 2011, the man's case was brought to court. He was charged with first-degree murder, first-degree kidnapping, and, of course, sexual assault. Mano tried to challenge the accusations, arguing that he deserved some leniency because he disclosed the location of Shania's body. However, the hitch was likely that Mano or his attorney misjudged the situation when they shared this information with the police. Nonetheless, on April 8, 2013, Mano was offered a deal: plead guilty to first-degree murder and serve life in prison without the possibility of parole. Mano refused and went to trial. During the trial, a forensic expert testified that he found a small bruise on Shania's left cheek, wounds on intimate parts of her body, and 2 abrasions on the upper thighs. 2 abrasions on the upper inner thighs matched the elastic of the underwear she was wearing. The cause of death was asphyxiation. Although no semen was found, other evidence, surveillance camera footage, phone records, and even soil samples linked the man to the crime scene. On May 23, 2013, the jury found Mano guilty of first-degree murder and several other charges except for 1 count related to assault. During the sentencing hearing, Mano did not allow any of his relatives to speak on his behalf. He explained that it would only matter if he could count on being released, but now the choice was between life imprisonment and the ultimate punishment. On May 29, 2013, the jury recommended the death penalty for Mano. The court sentenced him to death for first-degree murder and 58 to 72 years for all other charges. On July 6, 2011, Antoinette was rearrested and charged with first-degree murder in addition to the already presented charges, including human trafficking and kidnapping. On October 18, 2013, she reached a plea deal. Its essence was that Antoinette did not admit guilt, but acknowledged that there was sufficient evidence to prove her culpability for second-degree murder. As part of the deal, the first-degree assault charge against her was dropped. She was sentenced to imprisonment for a term of 17 to 21 years. Therefore, she could be released as early as 2027. In court, she apologized to Bradley, the father of her daughter. Antoinette stated that she had done everything possible for her children. "I never claimed to be a perfect mother, but I was a good mother. I did what I had to do to provide for them. I did everything to ensure they were okay. No one helped me," she said. The judge disagreed with her. He stated that she could have saved her daughter's life, but she didn't. "You had the time, opportunity, and means to save her, and you didn't do it. You are not a good mother. This should not have happened," he said. Additionally, relatives were always ready to help her, as was Bradley. The judge suggested that she work with a psychologist during her imprisonment. Another shocking fact in this story is that when Antoinette gave her daughter to Mano, she was expecting another child. Of course, the child was taken by Child Services. In turn, Bradley stated that he still mourned his daughter, but had long forgiven Antoinette, as well as Shania. He told her, "Perhaps you can use this time to delve into yourself and help others by sharing your story." The man said that someday, perhaps, he could talk to Antoinette and find out what was going on in her mind. But not now. He hoped that Shania's story would help save other children. Unfortunately, this was not the last tragedy in the man's family. Due to a terrible turn of events, Shania's older half-brother from her father's side, Chavez Lockhart, was shot on May 25, 2017. He was in a car when he was attacked by 18 and 17-year-old killers. Chavez was only 20 years old. He was buried next to his sister. Approximately a month before her disappearance, the police stormed Antoinette's house. They were interested in illegal substances. They were obliged to report to the Child Services that they visited the house in connection with the illegal substances and that there were children present. Then the girl would have been immediately sent to live with her father, where she would have been safe. However, they chose not to follow the protocol. Furthermore, the school where Shania attended daycare was concerned about the well-being of Antoinette's children, but no one took any action. As a result, Shania lost her life when her mother sold not only her body, but also her innocence, freedom, and life for a paltry debt. Immediately after the sentencing, Mano filed an appeal, but it was not successful. And that means that someday the officers will walk down a long corridor, open the door to Mario's cell, handcuff him, and take him to a small room no bigger than the hotel room where he took Shania. Then they will lay him down, restrain him, deprive him of the ability to move, to resist, just as Shania had none of this when he heartlessly took her life. He will receive an injection. He will struggle, resist, losing his last strength, just as Shania did before she perished. But just as she couldn't escape, her killer won't see freedom either. And perhaps the last thing he will see, closing his eyes, will be her face.